days from here, so we won't reach it today. I think I can handle riding west.
That's fine with me if that's what you want to do, kid. You'll be able to see our dust behind you. Don't get more than a mile or so ahead of us, though, in case you run into trouble and have to light a shot back here.
By the time he saddled the gun and led him back to the front of the wagon train, all the teams were in their traces, and the wagons were ready to roll.
I'll see you later.
Come back
Let's
in
go.
when it gets big
Let's
today. We'll stop and eat.
Sounds good.
The kid glanced back along the line of canvas-covered vehicles. Jessica's wagon was the ninth in line. She had donned her sunbonnet and climbed to the high seat on the front of the wagon to grip the reins in her hand.
Mega love shoutout dyan sa
She gave him a slight
inyo.
nod, but he couldn't be sure.
Let's go.
He lifted a hand and touched the fingers to the brim of his hat anyway, then turned and yielded the gun to the horse.
Buang naman
The horse carried him in an easy lope across the arid plains, and the wagon soon dwindled in the distance behind him. Unlike had been right about the kid being able to see the wagon
Hindi
train's
na
dust
panuagi
behind him.
mautad din
Every
berarti
time he
berat
looked back over
tumon
his shoulder, the pale cloud hung in the sky. It was already turning grassy, even though the sun hadn't been up for long. If the dust wasn't there, it would mean the wagons had stopped. If that happened before midday, it probably meant trouble. For that reason, the kid checked his back trail fairly often. Most of his attention was focused in front of him and to the sides. Not many places to hide existed in the mostly featureless landscape.
VGB, you're already VGBG ah.
So small they were nothing more than moles. He didn't see how a war party of 100 Apache warriors could conceal themselves behind such skimpy cover. It was more likely they would be hiding in one of the dry washes that slashed across the land. From time to time, a cloudburst would dump a lot of rain into the hills and roasted the corn, and that water had to go somewhere. It cut arroyos into the plains as it rushed southward from the hills. Once the thirsty ground had sucked up all the water, nothing was left but the
Wanna
bone-dry
dance or
horses
what?
who waded dry. Most of those arroyos were shallow, but some were deep enough to hide men on horseback. Whenever the kid came to one, he reined in and studied it carefully before he began searching for a place where the banks were shallow enough to allow the wagons to cross. Some of the washes were straight, and he could see a good distance along them in both directions. Others, however, twisted and turned, winding their way across the plains like a snake, and those were the ones that made the kid nervous. He had no way of knowing what might lurk just around the nearest bend. But as the sun rose higher and the morning passed, he didn't see any signs of life except for a few snakes and lizards, and every now and then a distant rider pacing. He knew that was either Scott Harwood or Milo Farnham. At midday, the dust cloud from the wagon train began to dissipate, telling the kid the canvas-covered vehicles had come to a stop. He turned and rode back toward the train. It didn't take long for the wagons to come into view. When he looked to the sides, he saw Harwood and Farnham angling in toward the wagons, too. The kid hadn't had anything to eat since breakfast, only an occasional sip from his canteen, so his belly was empty. Horace Dunlap waved him on in.
Miss Minute said for me to tell you to come on back to the wagon. She'll have food for you and Scott.
Much obliged.
The kid was a little surprised that Jessica had volunteered to feed him, but she seemed to be a walking contradiction, interested in it one moment, sharp and angry with him the next. When he reached the wagon, he saw that Scott Harwood had beaten him there. In fact, Harwood was standing at the rear of the vehicle next to the lower tailgate where Jessica had spread a cloth with some thick sandwiches on it. He had a hand on her shoulder, and the stance was definitely intimate.
Horace told me you've been out there scouting this morning. See anything unusual?
A lot of miles and nothing. This is pretty empty country.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you know the Apaches were raiding on this side of the border when you started out here?
You can talk about the Apaches later. Right now, you both need to eat.
The kid took the sandwich she gave him. It was a chunk of roast beef between two thick slices of bread smeared with butter, and he thought it was good. Not the sort of gourmet fare he'd been accustomed to in his former life as Conrad Browning, but a lot better than gnawing on a hunk of jerky. One of the other women brought them cups of hot coffee. By the time the kid finished the meal, he felt revitalized and ready to ride out again.
To answer your question, no. We didn't know the Apaches were raiding again. We didn't just start out blindly from El Paso and hope for the best. Horace and I both talked to officers at Fort Bliss who assured us this part of New Mexico territory was peaceful at the moment. I guess the reports of the raids just hadn't reached them yet. The Apaches can move pretty quickly when they want to.
Maybe they're already back below the border. We don't know that they're not.
That's true. We can't count on them being gone, though.
No, of course not. We still have to be ready for trouble.
A few more days and we won't have to worry about that anymore. We'll be in Rainy Grove Valley and we can start making our new home there.
Looking forward to that.
I'm much obliged to you for the meal, Mrs. Betty. It's very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're risking your life by riding with us, Mr. Morgan. The least we can do is feed you.
It would be even more risky for him if he was traveling alone. So we're doing him a favor too. The kid decided to ignore that statement and just lifted a hand in farewell.
So long.
He swung up into the saddle and rode back to the front of the wagon train. Dunlap was already there, sitting on horseback talking to Milo Farnham. The wizened little scout grinned at the kid.
So you've joined our ranks, have you, Morgan? I figured having another pair of eyes out there wouldn't hurt. That's the truth. You didn't see any signs of savages this morning? Not a one?
I'm thinking those varmints have already led a shuck back down into Mexico. And they can stay down there as far as I'm concerned.
A short time later, the wagon train got underway again. The kid, Harwood, and Farnham rode out together, splitting up when they were about a quarter-mile ahead of the wagon. Harwood angled off to the south, Farnham veered north, and the kid continued straight ahead. The hot sun beating down made him grateful for the shade cast by the broad-brimmed hat. He had to stop more often during the afternoon and pour water from his canteen into his hat so the dun could drink. It was during one of those pauses the kid heard something that made him lift his head and squint into the distance to the west. The sounds that drifted to his ears through the hot, still air were unmistakable. The kid stood stiffly, listening as the battle continued. It was hard to tell how far away the shooting was. The kid's hunch was that the fight was at least a couple of miles west of his position. He debated for a moment whether he should gallop ahead and try to lend a hand, or carry the warning of possible trouble back to the wagon train. That decision was taken out of his hands, as he could hear that the battle was over. For one side or the other, that had to be bad news.
Marimar, kumusta ka na Marimar? Diyos ko, ang tagal kong hindi Marimar. Ang tagal kong hindi nag-YouTube, Marimar. Jacob TV. Jonathan, maraming salamat. Talon-talon ka, Jonathan.
Which had come to a halt, no doubt at his order.
What is it, fellas? Trouble?
Or somebody.
Jacob.
I heard a lot of shooting up ahead.
I heard it too.
The kid nodded to indicate that he had as well.
Is it still going
Buhay
on?
man. Ay, nako, daming problema.
You
Diyos ko,
reckon the
ginoo
Apaches
ko.
jumped that cavalry patrol?
Jonathan.
Those troopers have had more than half a day to get ahead of us. As fast as they were moving when they left, they ought to be farther ahead.
Pamahuman ang problema, Marimar. Ay, hago kayo.
I would look over at the kid.
Dan, tamsak si Sikoy. Annalyn Pitts, miga-migalap. Share out si Sikoy. Salamat.
So the ruckus happened somewhere
Share
between
Dan community.
us and
Salamat,
those soldier
Jonathan.
boys.
Another entry.
We'll get out ahead and take a look-see. Just the four of us.
Another
The wagons will stay here. I'll tell the folks to get ready for trouble.
You ought to stay here too.
Simta,
boys.
Marimar.
Watch the wagon match.
Paita, jud ka, na problema, jud kung taman sa kanang papilis, kita rin ng bana,
I
Marimar.
never hid from trouble in my life, and I ain't fixing to start now.
You wouldn't be hiding.
Dihaguan, jud ko,
You'd be doing
sabi
smart.
ko, bahala na, ay.
People are
Hindi
depending
naman
on your
pwede
leadership to get
magmukmuk
them
ako
to
isang buwan,
What kind
higit
of
na.
a leader sends his men where he won't go his own self?
Jonathan, another
Wait here.
entry.
I'll be back in a minute.
What do we wait for him?
If we don't, we'll just have him.
Kuan, entry.
Next in a few minutes.
Mag, ano man ko, naman ko yung mini raffle karong kuan, karong December 23.
I've known him
Chani
pretty long.
Bekbek, mega love, shout out to you. Chani Bekbek.
Might as well wait for him because he's coming along anyway.
Karong
A
23.
couple of minutes later, Dunlap galloped back out to join them. The kid looked past him at the wagons and saw that all the outriders had been pulled in to help defend the immigrants.
Ow.
in need.
Let's go.
The shots had come from due west. The four men rode in that direction. They didn't push their horses. They
Good
encountered
afternoon,
trouble, they
Johnny
might use them to
Big
run for it, so they wanted their animals to be as fresh as possible. Anyway, the shooting was over. There was no real hurry. Suddenly, Dunlap leaned forward in the saddle.
Is that smoke I see up yonder?
It was. The kid had spotted the dark, thin ribbon of smoke curling into the air at the same time as the wagon master.
The hell's burning? I don't know, but I intend to find out.
Come on, horse. Wait a minute. There's not much smoke. Fire can't.
Grabe si Jonathan, ang laki na ng panalunan kay ano Jonathan, no?
Charging in there, get ourselves killed.
Nakita ko yung ano ni Bunso ata, busy po diri, oy.
You're right.
Dili na gani ko tig-ilis.
Neither did any of the other men.
Dahil Diyos ko,
All
ginoo
four
ko,
were
walang ko'y
very
ka na
when
ng
they rode toward the rising smoke.
mini. Di Diyos ko mag-ilis.
Flames consumed more
Laban
fuel.
pa kayo kung uoy.
The smoke gave them something to steer by, and it wasn't long before they came in sight of what was burning. The fire was
Nagantay
beginning
nga
to
ako
die
ngayon
down.
kung anong resulta doon sa kung lalabas pa ngayon yung
That's a freight wagon.
papel
One of them Conestogas.
The kid knew enough about the freight business to be aware that Conestoga wagons were longer, taller, and heavier than the light wagons used by
Wala pang
immigrants.
message sa akin
They were behemoths that were used only for hauling freight. The wagon hadn't gotten out there by itself. It had been pulled by a team of 8 draft horses, all of which lay slaughtered in their traces. Bloody, gaping wounds in the bodies of the unfortunate animals showed where large hunks of meat had been carved out and carried away. Patches.
Maojod.
There must be several teamsters with a wagon this size. Where are they?
Sinabi mo
The
pa.
answer to that as well as I do, Milo. They must have been killed in the fight. The Apaches have taken them prisoner. Poor doomed bastards.
An air of depressed foreboding hung over the
Naulaw
wagon
gani ko sa
train.
uban nga wabi to ko
Nobody
makasupport.
talked about it, but most of the
Saon
adults
man
knew
nga,
that
kuan
somewhere
man.
out there in the darkness, the freighters who had been with that Conestoga were probably screaming their lives away
Yaguan na ko
as they were
balik-balik
tortured
atong
to death by
immigration
their
si ko
Apache
balik.
captors. The leadership of the wagon train held a subdued meeting next to Jessica's wagon while they were eating supper. Dunlap had asked the kid to join in too. The kid and Farnham sat on a couple of kegs that had been taken from the wagon, while Jessica and Harwood sat together on the wagon tongue.
Who ships goods by a freight wagon anymore? Everybody uses a railroad now.
Not everybody. There's still a few freight outfits hanging on. Their rates are lower than the railroads. And if you're
Maulagi.
shipping something that doesn't have to
Pero
be
uya, wow, bayak po.
hurry, hammering tomatoes.
I'll bet that cavalry patrol caught up with that wagon just like they did with us.
Ginoo ko.
And that blasted Lieutenant Nicholson probably rode right
Dan,
on past
1,
it
2.
without even slowing down.
Wouldn't surprise me a bit. Now those poor fellas.
We have proof now that the Apaches are out here. Over and above what Nicholson
Sana
told us.
big, ha ha ha.
I've seen plenty of their depredations over in Arizona.
Gang of white outlaws could have burned that wagon.
And they could have. But why would outlaws bother?
Sana
with freight
big.
They wouldn't be carrying money or anything else they'd want. Besides,
Lagi oy, wow oy.
just killed the Teamsters. and
Sabi ko nga
everybody there.
pagka makauwi na tong isa,
This is Apache.
kahit gabi
Set
pa,
the wagon on fire like that,
At
carrying
magdamagan.
prisoners. I've seen it all.
kauli lang ni.
That's right. Question is, what do we do
Wa
about
na
it?
may magbantay ng upuan, di. Pwede na ko makasupport.
I
Kahit
reckon
gabi.
I follow 'em.
And do what?
Might be able to help those prisoners.
They're already dead, or if they're not, they're wishing they were. There's nothing we can do for them, Milo. Our
Agree.
responsibility is here with this wagon train and these people. We better double the guards, horse.
I agree. I'll be glad to stand a shift on watch.
I reckon we all do. I'll go around and talk to folks.
Live lang ko karon, isang oras lang ning live na ko.
How many more men we need?
Women can
Oo,
stand
kay
by
kinahanglan ba yung magpatatak
Oh, I
sa
don't
pas
recognize
sa
you.
kuan, sa visa, passport.
Not just any
Kailangan ba
woman,
yung tatakan?
but I can
Ikatulong
handle
ticket
my
na lagi na
own
karon.
some of the others.
Ang duha ka ticket
My
natunaw lang.
eyesight and hearing are just fine, thank you. I don't know what else you need.
Luhar
to
mo po
say.
siya kabuan mo
Target
dito.
shooting ain't the same thing as shooting at somebody.
I know that. I promise.
Magbayar na ato
If I
kung
have one of
September
those
na hong
blood
mayos-ayos
pressure
ng
spikes in
papel
my
ana.
side, I won't hesitate
Atod
to
garong
say.
pampuman.
A short time later, the meeting broke
Baita.
up as Dunlap went to arrange the guard duties. The kid had volunteered to take one
Dan,
of the
1,
first
2,
shifts,
3,
so he
4.
didn't bother spreading his bedroll under one of the wagons just yet. He could do
Jonathan.
that later. He checked on the gun, then took his Winchester and moved out a short distance from the circle of wagons.
Jonathan.
He hunkered down in a clump of greasewood where he wouldn't be visible and attuned his senses to the night around him. If there was anything out of place, a sound, a flicker of movement, even a smell that shouldn't have been there, the kid would know it. The 3 hours he spent standing watch passed in slow, tedious boredom.
Jonathan.
After his shift, he slept fitfully under one of the wagons for a few hours and was up again at dawn with the others, sipping coffee and getting ready to move out. 2 more
Labas
days
ako, Marimar.
bring them
Sige
the
lang,
main
Marimar.
playground
Walay problema.
before Dunlap.
Isang
From
oras
there,
lang din
the
ako
kid
ngayon.
didn't know where he would go.
Mag-ano
He
ako
would
eh.
deal with that when the time came.
Tim ganda. Miga-miga love share at si Lian Sevilla. Thank
The
you.
landscape was empty, and except for the dust cloud from the wagons behind him, the kid might have been the only living thing within 1,000 miles. Around mid-morning,
Pa-entry ka na,
he saw
Lian.
birds circling ahead of him.
Tim ganda, Team Love. Team
They wheeled through the
Puke.
air with a beauty and grace in striking contrast to their grim mission. They began to descend. A few minutes later, the kid spotted them surrounding a dark-shaped line on the ground several hundred yards away. Knowing there was no hope, he heeled his horse into a run anyway. The buzzards took off again as the gun came pounding up. He reined in and looked down at the man staked to the ground. The Apaches had worked him over good with their knives, hacking and mutilating and peeling away much of his skin. His eyelids had been cut off, so his lifeless eyes could only stare up into the blazing sun. The kid wondered if the man had still been alive when the Apaches left him there. It was a question that would never be answered. He was dead as hell now. The kid didn't have a shovel, so he waited for the wagons to get closer. The buzzards had been at the corpse already, and he didn't want them desecrating it anymore. When the wagons were within earshot, the kid drew his Colt and pointed it into the air. His signal brought Horace Dunlap over to his position. The wagon master grimaced and shook his head as he saw the body on the ground.
One of them Teamsters, I expected.
Must be, but there's not enough of him left to prove anything except that he went through hell dying. Women and youngsters with the wagons don't need to see this. If you bring me a shovel, I'll put him in the ground.
I'll help you.
Done 3-4.
An hour later, they had scraped a big enough hole out of the hard, rocky ground and lowered the dead man into it.
Saglit lang siya ni Big ha. Maglagay mo na ako
Back
ng
from the
uling.
wagon train along with the shovel. When the grave was covered up, Dunlap stood at the foot of it and took his hat off.
Lord, I don't know this poor sinner's name. But if any fella deserved a nice, comfortable spot in your bunkhouse, I reckon it's him. Have mercy on him. And on the fellows that were with him that we may never find. Bring him all to be with you. Amen.
When the
Ano,
kid
asar
didn't
ka sa
receive
akin
that
kagapon,
benediction,
oh.
Dunlap glanced over.
Magaling ka lang
You ain't a religious man?
mangasar sa akin, ah. Tapos ikaw,
I've done some things in my life. No. Let's just say
Oy,
I'm not sure
bakikay.
the Lord wants anything to do with me anymore.
Dan
I think
share.
this old head of mine, you're wrong about that. I'll take the wagon
Makikay.
around this spot.
Tawa talaga ko ng tawa. Kikikay.
They didn't find the bodies of the other Teamsters, and by nightfall there had been no other signs of the Apaches. The kid wondered if they had staked out the corpse as a warning to the wagon train to turn back. If that had been the intention, it had failed. Dunlap was determined to push on,
Kikay.
and the kid didn't blame him. According to the wagon master, by the time the sun went down again, they would be in Rain Crow Valley.
Talon-talon kami.
And so did the next morning. After the midday stop, the wagons rolled again, heading north. All during the long afternoon, the hills seemed to recede in front of them, so the destination seemed as far away as it had been when they had started. Gradually, though, the kid could tell.
Pasensya ka na, Jonathan. Isang oras lang ako, Jonathan.
The ground had some slope to it as they climbed.
Nagluluto ako, ano lang ako ni Lolo ba kay wala, namumula na eh. Namumula na yung tinggil ng whitey ko. Ay, Diyos ko.
There's going to be an ambush right on the other side of the pass. It's the best place for it.
The kid and Farnham followed his example, gripping their rifles tightly. They rode through the wide pass until the landscape before them dropped down into a broad, surprisingly green valley.
Tingnan mo, Bakikay.
Every bit as beautiful as Dunlap had promised.
Bakikay.
And there were no Apaches in sight.
Taway ka ha.
No shots rang out. Nothing threatened.
Welcome to Rain Crow Valley.
The three scouts spread out to search the area on the other side of the pass. According to the prearranged plan, Dunlap had stopped the wagons before they entered the pass, and the vehicles wouldn't proceed until he got the all clear from Harwood, Farnham, and the kid. As he rode along the bank of a small creek, the kid scared up a small herd of deer, but that was the only life he saw other than a few birds in the scrub pines. He rendezvoused with Harwood and Farnham at the mouth of the pass, and reported the lack of any threat that he found.
Same here.
The valley appears to be empty. Now let Horace know. If you two want to stay over here and look around a little more, that's fine.
I'm surprised nobody has settled this place before now.
Well, it's a long way from anywhere, and you got to travel through some pretty rugged country to get to it.
You saw that for yourself the past few days. There's no railroad in here and ain't likely to ever be one. The soil's good enough for farming and there's large enough graves for a small herd of cattle, but nobody's going to get rich settling here. But if you're looking for a nice place to live, or a fellow who's willing to work hard and get by, Rain Crow Valley fits the bill. How about you, Morgan? You looking to settle down? Not hardly. I reckon I knew that. You ain't the type to ever let grass grow under your feet, are you? I might have been. I won't even ask you what happened to change things. Ain't none of my business.
Done,
You guys
1
came
to
with us
4.
this far, even though it turned out we didn't need your gun after all.
They looked back to see the wagons emerging from the past and starting the descent into the valley. The trail was an easy one. It was almost like the valley had been put here specifically for those immigrants. Dunlap and Harwood led the wagons to a broad
Malapit ba sa dagat sa inyo,
next to
Kai?
one of the streams. The settlers would need a place to camp for a while until they'd had a chance to explore the valley and decide where they wanted to build their cabins and ranch houses.
Akong maligo ng
Later
dagat pa.
on, the camp might even serve as the site of a small community that was likely to grow up to serve the needs of the settlers. When word got around, it was possible more immigrants might arrive in Rainbow Valley. For now, though, the most important thing was getting situated for the night. Dunlap had the drivers pull the wagons into the usual circle for defensive purposes and also to shelter the livestock. As the shadows of dusk began to gather, cooking fires sprang up. The trees that grew along the creek provided fuel. The kid unsaddled his gun and picketed the horse with the other saddle mounts. Although he had no intention of settling here, it might be a good idea to stay for a few days and allow the gun to rest. That would also give him a chance to make sure the immigrants were settling in all right. Dunlap caught the kid's eye and waved
Ano
him
kaya
over.
gagawin dito sa Gcash ko tayo? Hindi pa ayos.
I
Kainis.
figure those Apaches are back across the border by now.
Rachel Antolido,
They
Miguel
stopped
Miguel
long enough to
shut
take that
up.
freight wagon, but with the cavalry patrolling, they're going to want to get back to their stronghold in
Ikay
Mexico.
4 to
You're
8.
probably right. I agree that it's a good idea to stay alert, though.
You going to be here with us?
For a day or two. I don't know for sure yet when I'm riding out.
You know you're welcome to stay as long as you want. We're much obliged to you for your help.
I didn't do anything but
May
ride along
utang
with
pa
you.
ako sa'yo,
Maybe
Kai.
so. But it eased my mind some, knowing that we had a fella as handy with a gun as you are along with us.
The kid assured
5
Dunlap
to
that he'd
8.
be glad to take a turn standing guard again, then went in search of some supper. For some reason, his footsteps led him toward Jessica Ritter's wagon. He expected to find Harwood there, but didn't see the scout, nor was Jessica visible outside the wagon.
Ikay,
The thought
sunod si
crossed the kid's
Jonathan.
mind that Jessica
4
and Harwood might be inside the
5
wagon.
to 8.
They were engaged to be married, after all. The kid stepped to the back of the wagon.
Everybody all right in there?
Jessica pushed aside one of the canvas flaps that hung over the vehicle's rear opening and looked out at him with an irritated expression on her face.
I dropped my blasted Dutch oven.
Are you all right? One of those things can break a toe.
Fine. It didn't land on my foot.
Jonathan.
But when I jumped back so it wouldn't, I banged my head on one of the iron ribs that hold up the canvas cover.
Where's Harwood?
Scott said he was going to scout around a little more before it gets dark.
That's probably a good idea. He's devoted to his job.
Yes. Very devoted.
Let me give you a hand with that oven.
For a second, Jessica looked like she was going to
Jonathan.
refuse, but then she nodded her head.
All right. Thanks.
The kid lowered the tailgate, stepped up on it, and climbed into the wagon. With the sun already down, it was pretty dim inside, under the arching canvas cover. He saw the Dutch oven and bent to pick it up. Jessica reached for it at the same time.
I said you could help. I didn't say you had to pick it up yourself.
Their hands brushed together and stopped short of the Dutch oven, with skin pressed to skin. The kid expected Jessica to pull her hand away, but she didn't.
I can get it.
Before he knew what was happening, she had pressed her mouth to his. The kid moved his hand to her shoulders and eased her away from him.
Damn you, Morgan. Why did you have to come right along and get me all mixed up like this?
If you're mixed up, it's because of you, not me. You'd be better off thinking about your fiance.
Stop it. I don't want to think about him. He's not thinking about me right now, I can promise you that. The only thing he's thinking about is finding some Apaches to kill.
Sounds to me like a good way of staying alive. I'm sorry if there's trouble between the two of you, but I'm sure as hell not the solution.
I'm not going to marry him.
1
I
to
decided
4
that even
da.
before you
1
came
to
along.
4.
I only agreed
Si
because
Rachel.
I'd known him for so long. Since before my husband died. I guess I was scared to face things alone.
You let me work that out without my help.
He started to turn away. She clutched at him.
Kid, please.
Let go of her, you son of a bitch!
From the wagon's tailgate, Scott Harwood flung himself toward him. He tackled the kid, knocked him away from Jessica. Both men crashed to the floor of the wagon. Harvard started throwing wild punches in the blue.
Scott, stop it! Stop it!
The kid reached up to grab the front of
Mega
Harvard's
mega
shirt.
love shout out Sharon Sab malamig na hapon te. Maraming salamat
The
Inday
kid
Sharon.
broke away from him and came up on his
Crystal
knees.
Petariliana mega mega love shout out Inday Enelen in Germany. Mega mega love shout out Inday.
They crashed together, but this time the tackle took both of them off the rear of the wagon. When they hit the ground, they broke apart.
Toledo.
People had heard the shouting from Jessica's wagon. They were hurrying toward it to see what was wrong.
Sharon.
The kid wasn't walking
Salamat
around
Inday
with the
Crystal
bike. As he
Pet.
got to his feet, he backed off. It was a pointless struggle.
Sharon
It shouldn't have
Sab.
happened in the first place.
You got it all wrong, Harwood. There's nothing between Mrs. Ritter and me.
Crystal Pet Arellano.
I saw the two of you together. You either attacked her or you're trying to steal her away from me.
Scott, stop it! Mr. Morgan didn't do anything. It was me. All me.
What are you saying, Jeff?
You hurt me.
Crystal
I'm sorry,
Pet
Scott, but
Inday Inilan.
I can't marry you.
Harwood stared at Jessica uncomprehendingly for a long moment. Finally, a grim realization settled over his face.
I was right.
Harwood turned his head to look at the kid.
You did this.
And with that, he twisted his body and grabbed for the gun on his hip. Harwood's hand opened, releasing his gun as he toppled forward.
Dan FB share Atirap. Maraming salamat.
I'm obliged to you for not killing.
The kid slid his Colt back into leather as he looked down at Harwood. The scout was out
Ang
cold.
manim.
Milo Farnham came up and scooped Harwood's gun from the ground.
I'll hang on to this for a while.
Salamat
Just
Inday.
to make sure everybody's cooled off.
That's a good idea, Milo.
Dunlap turned to face the crowd.
You folks go on about your business. All the excitement's over.
A grim-faced Jessica climbed down from the wagon and went over to kneel beside the unconscious Harwood. She put a hand on his head where Dunlap had hit it.
Like na nako apat te. Salamat Inday Sharon.
Reckon he'll have a headache when he wakes up, but that's all.
No, that's not.
Oh,
He'll have a broken heart, too.
ain't nothing I can do about that, man.
No.
5 to 8 po. Ayun.
There's nothing anybody can do.
May entry ka na
He
dahil
turned away
Sharon.
and walked toward his horse,
Rachel
leaving Jessica kneeling beside Harwood. Dunlap and Farnham followed him.
Maybe it ain't none of my business.
Anton.
But if you want to tell me what just happened, kid, I'm listening.
And if I don't want to tell you,
Then I'd be obliged if you did anyway. I signed on to bring these folks out here. They're my responsibility.
not anymore they're not. They're here. This is Rain Crow Valley. You did your job.
I reckon you're right about that. But I still feel like I got a duty to look after them. There's been some talk about making me the mayor of these parts, if you want to call it that. There's no town yet, but maybe there will be one of these days.
And Scott's our friend. We want to
Ato
know
na,
what happened
dahil
to
sila.
Sophie.
Fine. Mrs. Ritter decided she doesn't want to
Harang.
marry him
Maraming salamat sa paharang. Harang.
Why would he do
Jonathan.
that?
because he saw her kissing me.
You say she was kissing you?
That's the way it was.
I suppose I can believe that. I ain't known Miss Ritter all that long, but she strikes me as a gal who usually does just about whatever she wants to.
You didn't do anything to put the idea in her head.
No, I didn't. And you can believe me or not. I don't really give a damn.
I reckon I believe you. But no matter who's to blame for it, this here's a mess. We got to do something about it.
I intend to.
The kid
Kapite.
picked up his saddle blanket
Sige
and
lang.
threw it over the gun's back.
Lemon ang
Hold on
iniinom
there.
ko.
What are you doing?
Getting ready to ride out.
Tonight?
I think that would be a good idea.
Oh, there ain't no need to do that. Just steer clear of Scott and Miss Ritter. Maybe they'll work things out between them, and maybe they won't. We'll give them a chance.
This isn't that big a camp.
The kid lifted his saddle and placed it on the gun's back.
There's too much of a chance I'd run into one or the other of them. And if that happens, Harwood's liable to try gunning me again.
Oh, but you can't travel at night.
I don't see
Si
why not.
Annalyn pala
The
yung
kid fastened the
naghuhugas
saddle
doon.
cinches.
This is a big valley. I can make camp on my own a few miles away, where there's no chance of more trouble with Harwood. He's going to be riding on in a day or two anyway. I'll find somewhere else, maybe lay up for a week or two to let my horse rest. What's north of this valley, anyway?
More mountains. Get over them, and there's a basin with some ranches and a little settlement called San Blanco.
That's where I'll head
Si
next.
Annalyn.
Come on, at least let me round up some supplies for you. We got plenty of food. We can spare enough to get you to that town. Shoot, that's the least we can do for you.
The kid wasn't sure why everybody felt so grateful to him when he really hadn't done anything to help these pilgrims. But some extra provisions would make his journey easier. So he nodded.
All right, thanks.
Come on, Milo, we'll get those supplies.
You can handle that. I'm gonna stay here just to make sure there's no more trouble.
There won't be.
You can't be sure about that. Depends on how
Done
things
9 to
always are.
12.
Suit yourself.
Scott ain't a bad hombre, you know.
I never said he was.
He's pretty close-mouthed cuss most of the time. And he ain't what you call friendly to most folks. But he really cares about that woman, Mrs. Ritter.
I don't doubt it. Any problems they have are between them, though. I don't have anything to do with it.
I got a hunch you're right. I've seen the way she looks at you when she thinks nobody's watching. I didn't know her when her husband was over there in Arizona with Crooks. Scott's told me enough, I figure she was really devoted to him. Must have hit her mighty hard when he died. Scott said he figured she never wanted anything to do with another man after that, but he got it in his head he was going to see if she'd warm up to him anyway. Well, she did, after so long a time. But now maybe she figures she made a mistake.
I hope they work it out. I don't wish trouble on anybody.
That's sort of an odd way for a
Jonathan
gunfighter
9 to
feeling.
12.
Oh, that gunfighter just wants to be left alone.
Dunlap walked up a moment later, carrying a canvas sack that bulged with food and supplies.
Ah, there you go, kid. With our thanks.
I'm the one who ought to be thanking you.
The kid took the sack and tied it to his saddle.
Good luck to you.
Same to you, kid.
Jonathan.
You happen to see whether Harwood regained consciousness yet?
Yeah, he was sitting and talking with Miss Ritter. I didn't disturb him, and nobody else is either.
Good. I hope it all works out. Enjoy your lives here in Rain Crow Valley.
He touched his fingers to the brim of his hat in a salute.
Jonathan.
He turned the gun to
5 million people in the house. Thank you so much.
Full night had fallen, but once the kid was away from the campfires and his eyes had adjusted, the millions of stars in the ebony sky overhead provided enough light for him to see where he was going. He followed the creek, figuring that would be the easiest route to the northern part of the valley where he intended to spend the night. It likely would take him a few days to get out of the valley and cross that mountain range Dunlap had mentioned. He and the Dun would be
6
worn out by the time
million.
they
Thank
reached the
you
base
so
of the
much,
hillside.
guys.
He was already looking forward to finding a settlement and taking it easy for a few days. A half moon rose in the east and scattered more silvery light across the valley. The creek's meandering course quickly took the kid out of sight of the wagon train camp. When he
13.
looked back, he could no longer see the fires. He rode on until he thought he was 4 or 5 miles north of the camp. When he came upon a pine-dotted knoll overlooking the creek, he decided it would make a decent place to stop for the night. He rode up the slope and found that the top of the knoll was fairly level. It would do to spread his bedroll, and there was enough grass to keep the
Taglit
gun
lang kayo, ha?
The kid dismounted,
Taglit
unsaddled,
lang.
and picketed the horse, then delved into the bag of supplies Dunlap had given him. He found some biscuits that felt fresh, and a hunk of salt pork. Starting a fire and brewing some coffee seemed like too much trouble. He would make a cold camp for the night, then have coffee in the morning.
10.
He sat on a fallen pine to eat, washing down the food with water from his canteen. When he was finished with his meal, he piled up some pine boughs, spread his blankets on top of them, took off his boots, and stretched out with his gun belt coiled on the ground beside him. His head rested on his
Ikay
saddle.
9 to 12.
He rolled onto his side and closed his eyes to go to sleep. The kid quickly flung his bedroll aside and reached for the revolver lying next to him. With the Colt in his hand, he got to his feet and walked over to the edge of the knoll. His pulse hammered in his head as he stared to the south toward the wagon camp. The gunfire wasn't the only thing that alarmed him. As he looked in that direction, he saw an orange glow climbing into the sky, faint at first, then growing stronger with every passing second. Something was burning down there, and the flames were big enough to light up the heavens. Suddenly, a dark shape flung itself out of the shadows and lunged at him. The Apache never had a chance.
Ikay ulit.
He wasn't alone, though. The kid switched his aim to where the flash had come from and went down in a rolling dot.
Costoras and Santes. Mega mega love. Shout out.
Trying to get around
Saan
the
ba yun makikita? Wala labas
The kid's door
akin.
came up, but the Apache was too close.
Kahihangan, hinahanglan, apat lang.
The kid expected
Anong
to feel the fire
hinahanglan,
full
apat
speed
lang?
at any second.
Ano sabi mo, Day? Sharon? Okay, natikita ko na ayun. Yan tapos pag mag-comment ka sa video dyan, lagyan mo lang ng ano, ganito
The The man
Lagyan mong love mayang, ganyan oh, love mayang, bruha, ganyan. Ganyan mo ilagay.
fired the last round in the cold cylinder.
Pwede ring mayang bruha lang, ganon. Tapos mag-comment ka muna kung ano napanood mo. Tapos lagyan mo ganyan, ganyan, mayang bruha, ganyan. Di ba pag napanood mo na kung anong napanood mo noon, sunod, lagyan mo ng dulo ng mayang bruha, ganyan.
The kid's instincts told him that his enemies were dead. He trusted those instincts, but he wanted confirmation. He stood up, slipped the knife behind his belt, and reached into his pocket.
Para marami kang interest sa 23 ng raffle nito, Inday.
With the gun ready, he checked the 3 bodies.
Kung may time ka, ganyan.
With that grim chore out of the way,
6 million people in the house, thank you so much. Dan, 13 to 16.
He hadn't forgotten the sounds of battle he had heard coming from the south, or the glow of flames lighting up the sky. Bastards. Cruel bastards. The Apaches
Sana mabuno tayo doon, Day, no?
for the past couple of days, he thought. They were probably curious and wanted to see where the immigrants were going. Once it was obvious they planned to settle in Rainbow Valley, the Apaches had moved in to snatch away their chance for happiness, and most likely their lives as well. The raiders had been lurking out there in the darkness, watching the camp, and they had seen the kid ride away. They had sent 3 men after him, no doubt thinking that was plenty to
Apat
swallow for a
kay.
white man. Those 3 had found out just how wrong that was.
Niipon ko muna dito sa marami.
As
Bago
soon
ko
as
ilagay
everything was
dito
ready,
sa ano.
he put his foot in the stirrup, swung up into the saddle. Leaving the dead warriors where they had fallen, he rode down the hill to the creek, started south, and pushed the gun as fast as he dared in the darkness. From time to time, he stopped to listen. But he didn't hear any more shots. A feeling of rage filled him. Fate had conspired to keep him away from the settlers on the very night they could have most used his help. The orange glare in the sky brightened, then began to fade. Fires were dying down. It was just like the attack on the Conestoga, only on a much larger scale. He dreaded the sight of the devastation that awaited him. But not for a second did he consider turning back. He had ridden out of that village several days earlier when violence was about to erupt. That decision had nagged him. The circumstances tonight were much different. He hadn't had any idea the Apaches were about to attack the camp. He wasn't going to turn away again. He slowed down as he approached the camp. Fires still burned here and there, but most of the wagons had already been consumed. Bodies, human and animal alike, littered the ground thickly. All the oxen had been slaughtered, but as far as the kid could tell, the Apaches had taken some of the horses with them. They could trade those horses below the border, maybe, or kill them and eat them on the way back to Mexico. He dismounted and started
Dan,
to camp
13 to
searching for survivors.
16. Apat.
Horace Dunlap's body lay just inside the circle of charred wagons. The wagon master still clutched a gun in his hand. He had been shot to pieces, riddled with at least a dozen bullets. The kid would have been willing to bet that Dunlap had taken some of the attackers with him, though. He moved on, listening for a moment, peering through the flickering light of the flames that still burned for any sign of movement. He didn't find any. After a few moments, he came to Jessica's wagon. At least, he thought it was her wagon. In the midst of all this destruction, it was difficult to be sure. He saw a familiar figure lying face down next to the burned wagon. The kid hurried over and knelt next to the man, grasping his shoulder and rolling him onto his side. Scott Harwood's head hung limply on his neck. His face was twisted in death. The broken shaft of an arrow protruded from his chest. The kid could tell what had happened. That arrow had driven deeply into Harwood's body, killing him, and the shaft had broken off when the scout pitched forward. Still on one knee, the kid looked around, thinking that Jessica's body had to be nearby. He figured she would have died fighting, just as many of the others obviously had. He didn't see her, though. He kept looking. The kid swung around to see where the noises had come from.
Who's there? Can you hear me?
Over here.
The kid ran toward one of the sprawled shapes. And
Dan,
dropped to the
13,
weak side.
naka-live.
The wounded man lay on his side,
Naka-live na siya?
easing him over onto his back. The kid popped the man's head up. Milo Farnham's
Pa,
skirt
17 to
front was dark
20.
and sodden with blood.
Kanina, wala man siyang live kanina. Naka-live na.
You? That's right, Mom. Take it easy.
Hindi ko alam.
I'll see if I can help you.
Ain't no chance of that. No, good shot. I've been trying to hang on because I thought maybe could hear the fight and come back.
I'll go get my canteen.
No. Water. Water won't help. I won't.
Baka mamaya masungkit ako ni Lolo, iniris ko.
Those red bastards did.
What didn't they do, Milo?
They didn't kill everybody.
Sige, kahit.
Yeah.
Seryoso ka talaga dyan.
They
Dan 5 to 6. Siya ni Betty.
and Miss Price and her daughter and another lady, Leah Gabbard. I saw them drag those gals off. Thought maybe you'd come back. I can tell you. They headed south. You gotta go after.
I'll go after them, Milo. You did the right thing by hanging on until I got here. I'll go after them and do everything I can.
Hindi sinabi ng mga nagdan 13. Oh, wala naman sinabi. Iniris ko.
Since the Apaches had prisoners,
Kasi pagpunta ko kanina, wala naman, hindi naman siya
it was likely they would head for the
Hindi
border
naman
and
siya
straight
live
line, just as fast as they could.
Dan
But
17 to
the kid couldn't be
20.
absolutely certain of that. So the smart thing to do would be to wait until morning and pick up their trail once it was light. A war party of 100 men couldn't travel without
Historias
being reminded by the sun.
interesantes. Nagbaba ng bahay, guys.
But he thought about Jessica Ritter and the other 3 women. He wanted to keep going, but he forced himself to stop and
Ano
unsaddle.
ba yung kaninang bin?
If he was going to have any chance of rescuing the captives, he had to keep his emotions at bay. He had to be as coldly calculating as a machine. It was the only way to overcome the overwhelming odds he faced. The kid picketed his horse and spread his bedroll again for the second time that night. He wrapped up in his blankets against the nighttime chill.
Oo nga, live yun. Giatay na. Wala na. Sipa na naman ako ni
He had
Lolo.
seen horrific images of fire and blood and death. He hadn't witnessed the slaughter at the wagon camp, but in his mind it was like he had been there, watching and hearing everything. Every terrible thing. Despite that, weariness eventually claimed him, but his sleep was restless and haunted by nightmares. He was glad when he woke
Rachel
up the
Ann
next morning in the
Toledo,
cold
Dan
gray
5
light of
to
dawn.
8. Oh, sige na, Anday.
The kid
Saglit lang
stood
ha.
up and stretched to ease
Rachel
muscles that
Ann
ached from tossing and turning so much on the hard ground. He
Toledo.
gathered broken branches from some nearby scrub brush and built a small fire. He soon had coffee boiling and shaved slices off a chunk of salt pork into his frying pan. There were plenty of
Rachel Ann
biscuits left in the
Toledo,
bag of
Sharon
provisions Forrest
Sab.
Dunlap had gathered for him the night before. As he hunkered on his heels next to the fire and ate, the kid thought about the people who had donated that food to him.
Sharon Sab. Malay mo,
Most of them, maybe
sisertehin.
all of them, were dead. The meal
Kung
tasted like
pabunot
ashes
pangalan mo,
in his mouth,
Inday. Di may
but he forced
pagkasmas ka
himself
na.
to eat anyway. By the
Ay,
time the
nako.
sky was light enough for him to start searching for the war party's tracks, he had his gear packed away and the Dun saddled. He mounted and began to ride along the edge of the hills. He had gone less than a quarter mile when he came to a broad swath of footprints and moccasin tracks that led off to the south. Some of the Apaches were on foot, but that wasn't surprising. The kid turned to follow the tracks. Figuring out how many men were in the war party was impossible. The prints were too jumbled up. The only thing he could be sure of was that they were all alive.
21.
From the looks of it, the Apaches weren't trying to cover their trail. They
Saglit
knew they
lang
had
Jonathan
avoided
na
the cavalry
22.
patrol, which had moved on west, and they wouldn't be expecting any pursuit from the devastated wagon camp. As far as they knew, they hadn't left anyone alive behind them. After a few days, when the 3 Apaches who had gone after the kid failed to return, the rest might start to wonder what had happened to them. They wouldn't be too concerned, though. The kid was only one man.
24.
The night's chill disappeared rapidly as the sun climbed into the sky. As the heat grew, the kid wondered how far it was to the next source of water. He had filled both of his canteens in the creek in Rainbow Valley before he rode away. But in the semi-desert,
Dan
that water
17
wouldn't
to
last long.
20.
The gun would require quite a bit of it.
Tatlo.
A couple of hours after sunup, he spotted dust rising. Unless the war party had made a sharp turn for some unfathomable
pala.
reason, that was the wrong direction for them. The kid reined in and rested his hands on the saddle horn as he studied the dust. It wasn't the first such cloud he had seen recently. In that arid country, any group larger than a few riders raised considerable dust. The cloud was about the same size as the one he had seen a few days earlier as the cavalry patrol approached the wagon train. The kid decided the smart thing to do was wait and see. The delay in going after the Apaches grated on him,
Tamsak Mayang, 9 to 12.
He looked around, spotted a cluster of boulders about half a mile away, and rode toward it, figuring the rocks would conceal him while he got a good look at those riders.
Ito na,
Once
Jonathan.
he was behind the boulders, he dismounted. And
Sharon,
put his
9 to
Winchester to a
12.
saddle sheet. He found a good spot where he could see the approaching dust cloud and waited. Within a few minutes, he could make out the riders. He thought he saw the bright colors of a flapping kitten, so he fetched his telescope from the saddlebags to check.
It's them. It's too late to do any good.
Sharon
He
sa...
closed the telescope, put it away, and stepped out from behind the boulders. He pointed the Winchester into the sky. The troopers turned toward him without stopping. The kid lowered the Winchester and waited until the blue uniformed soldiers rode up and reined in. Lieutenant Nicholson was in the lead, with Sergeant Brennan behind
Sharon
him.
Sab.
Morgan, what are you doing out here?
I'm trailing that Apache war party. What are you doing?
Not that I have to answer to you, but we're returning to Fort Bliss. We've reached the limits of the area we were supposed to patrol.
Let me guess. You didn't see any sign of the Apaches, did you?
As a matter of fact, no. What's that you said about trailing them?
You didn't see them because they didn't want you to see them. They
Mm.
probably knew where you were every minute of the day and night, and could have ambushed you at any time. The only reason you're not dead now is because they found a more tempting target, that wagon train.
The wagon train.
That's right. Except for 4 women the Apaches carried off as prisoners, every man, woman, and child in that party of immigrants is dead now. And I figure you're partially to blame for that.
Hold on just a damn minute. You best keep a respectful tongue in your head when you're talking to the lieutenant, mister.
I'm not in the army. Those gold bars don't mean anything
21
to
to
me. If
24.
you'd stayed with the wagons, the Apaches might not have
Kikay, miss you. Kikay. Busy ka dyan ah.
He handed his reins to Brennan. He turned to the kid. Tell me what
Ba,
happened.
Kikay.
The kid summed up the bloody, tragic circumstances in as few words as possible. Nicholson's face had acquired a tan during his service in the Southwest, but he turned pale underneath it as the kid described how everyone with the wagon train had been killed, except for the 4 women who were taken prisoner.
You say you were trailing the Apaches?
That's right. The tracks are hard to miss. You might have even noticed them if you'd kept riding.
We saw the
Apat
glow of the
kay.
sky from our camp last night.
Kani pa ko dito.
Sergeant told me
Nagpapa-entry
something
eh.
was on fire,
Kanina
and
pa
I
ko
was
dito
planning to
nag-entry.
investigate. I recalled that man
Dan
saying the wagon
7,
train
8.
was headed for Rain Crow Valley.
Siya ni Bekbek.
They wanted to be sure the settlers were all right.
Little late for that.
My God, I've had just about enough of you, mister.
Stand down, Sergeant. Civilians are entitled to their opinion even when they don't know what they're talking about. I had my orders. Mr. Morgan,
Jonathan,
and I followed
21 to
them. My
24.
conscience is clear.
If you want to follow something, how about following their tracks? The Apaches probably aren't expecting any pursuit. We might be able to catch up to them in time to do those women some good.
Nicholson frowned in thought as he considered the suggestion.
For God's sake, your orders are to find that war party, right?
22
To locate and engage the hostiles, yes.
Well, those tracks will lead you right to them. Even a stiff-necked son of Even you ought to be able to see that, Lieutenant.
You're right.
Jonathan.
Following those tracks is exactly what I should be doing, Mr. Morgan. And you're going to help me do it.
What are you talking about?
From this point on, consider yourself under my command. You are now attached to this patrol as a civilian scout, and therefore under the jurisdiction of the United States Army.
The hell you say?
Jonathan.
That's right, the hell I say. I'm declaring this part of the territory to be under martial law, and as such I have the right to impress civilians into temporary duty.
That can't be legal.
If you think so, you can take up the matter with my superior officers when we get back to Fort Bliss. In the meantime, you already said you were trailing those Apaches. I intend to do the same thing. Why should you object to riding with us?
It's not the riding with you I object to. It's the blasted business about being under your command.
Well, perhaps it won't come to that.
Rachel Ann,
We want the same thing, after
21
all, don't we?
24.
To punish those savages and deliver justice to them for their crimes.
That wasn't what the kid wanted at all. He wanted to rescue Jessica and the other 3 women. Killing some Apaches in the process would be a good thing, but it wasn't the main objective. If he said that, it would just lead to more arguing with Nicholson, and they already wasted enough time.
Let me get my horse. I'll ride with you.
I thought so.
The kid led the patrol to the tracks and pointed out how they arrowed straight south.
We're making a run for the border. The Apaches may not be expecting any pursuit, but they want to get below the line before anybody can catch up to them, just in case.
savages took 4 women as prisoners, you
Rachel
said?
Ann.
That's right.
Ayan.
This is Jessica Ritter. This is Violet Price. This is Price's daughter, Elsie, I think her name is, and a woman named Gabbard. I don't know if she was married or not. If she was, she's a widow now.
That's right.
Kikay Colette.
I hope circumstances allow us to be of assistance to you. The kid knew what that meant. Nicholson would be perfectly willing to sacrifice the prisoners' lives if doing so helped him destroy the war party. The odds of that happening were pretty slim, the kid thought.
25.
The patrol was outnumbered 3 to 1.
Yan Mayang, 21 to 24.
The
Okay.
best they could hope for
Saglit
would
lang,
be to
ha?
hit the Apaches hard, inflict
25,
some casualties, and
26.
get away without being wiped out themselves.
Saglit lang, Day.
But in doing so, it might provide enough of a distraction for the kid to rescue the captives. That was what he hoped for. The patrol headed south, following the tracks. Nicholson didn't really need the services of a scout. The trail was so easy to see, even a green one like him could follow. If Frank Morgan had been there, he could have examined the tracks and the droppings left behind by the Apache ponies and figured out how far ahead the war party was. The kid
28.
wasn't that skilled as a tracker, although the past couple of years had given him some experience in that area.
How far is it to the border?
I don't know. Around 50 miles, I'd say, but that's just a guess.
How will we know when we get there? There's no
Sino
river
hindi ko
separating the
nalista?
counties
Si
here in
Chani
New Mexico
Big at
territory
saka si
like there is
ano,
over in
si
Texas.
Don't know that either.
Sharon.
There are a few settlements right along the border.
Chani
I think.
Big
You may have to find one of them and ask folks
9
where
to
the line
10,
is.
dalawa
I
na.
can't pursue the hostiles into Mexico. You know that, don't you? If I were to cross the border, it might provoke an international incident.
We'll worry about the border when we get there. Right now, let's just keep moving as fast as we can without running these horses into the ground.
The kid
Chani Big
managed not to laugh.
Sunod si Sharon, 21,
It was unlikely
24.
anybody would know or care if Nicholson and his troops crossed the border. The Mexican government might make a statement on it later on. It would be too late to do anything other than complain. They could avoid the issue entirely by catching up with the war party and dealing with it sooner rather than later. Every hour those women were in the hands of the Apaches was another hour when something bad could happen. The kid was under no illusion about how the prisoners were being treated. Probably all 4 of them had been raped already. Even if they survived the ordeal and escaped from captivity, their lives had been changed forever. A lot of so-called good Christian folks wouldn't have anything to do with
Sharon
the woman
Sub.
who was laying with a savage, even against her will.
Jos TV, Miga Miga Love. Shout out sa iyo, Sir Jos
He
TV.
knew it was true. If there was anybody strong-willed enough to rebuild her life after such a thing,
May jacket ka na po, Sir
all the women
Jos
deserved
TV.
it, not just Jess. As they rode, the kid
May
constantly
entry ka
scanned the
po.
horizon ahead of them, looking
At
for the
tapos,
dust
sir,
raised by the Apaches, and also watching for places where there might be an ambush. The raiders
Past
could have left
24.
some warriors behind in case anyone gave chase. Even a relatively small group of
Kikay.
Apaches could
Taway
drive
talaga
quite a
si
bit of
Kikay.
damage if they took the cavalry by surprise. Nicholson called frequent halts to rest the horses. The kid didn't like the delays, but he knew it was the
Ngita,
right
past
thing to do.
25 to
On the
28.
frontier, a man's mouth had to be protected at all costs.
Pas ka rin doon sa kabila, pas ka rin dito. Nagpa-pine din kaya ako doon sa kabila, kaya kala mo ba?
During one of those stops, the kid was giving guns
Ah.
when Sergeant Brennan
Kala mo ikaw lang nagpa-pine hoy, nagpa-pine din
The
ako.
kid glanced at Brennan and saw the belligerent look on the non-com's face. That trouble the kid expected had shown up sooner than he anticipated.
You might have quit talking about how the lieutenant didn't stay with those pilgrims, Morgan. Where were you when those Apaches attacked?
Like I told Lieutenant Nicholson, I was camped a few miles up the valley.
How come? You traveled with them for several days. How come as soon as they got where they were going, you up and left?
That's none of your business.
I reckon it is. You can't go around accusing the lieutenant of abandoning those settlers when you did the same damn thing. Actually, what you did was worse to my way of thinking. The lieutenant
Nakita
had
kita, Diyos
orders
ko,
to follow.
nakakapagod, magtalon-talon, giatay.
You don't know what you're talking about, Sergeant. I had my reasons for what I did, and again, they're none of your business.
What were you doing, Morgan? Messing around with some poor sod buster's wife?
Back off.
That's it, ain't it? You didn't leave. They ran you up.
Sabi ni
You're
Diyos
just
Kikay
one
Kulit.
coming and can't keep his hands off other men's women.
Brennan.
Dan po Kikay Kulit, 25 to 28. Okay, copy Sharon.
Shoot me?
Copy si Chani Big Big, copy. Kaya mag-alala, sulat ko, saglit lang, baba mo na akong link.
Murder you drew on me. I'm not even carrying a gun.
Magbaba lang ako ng link, ha.
The kid turned away. Brennan's hand shot out and grabbed the kid's arm.
Don't turn your back on me, you know.
The kid twisted around and hooked his right fist into Brennan's midsection. The two troopers who had walked over with Brennan were quick to react. The kid avoided one man's charge, but the second man caught him with a moving punch that grazed his jaw. The impact was enough to make him take a step back. Before the trooper could go for a second blow, the kid snapped a left jab into the man's face. The kid swung a right and slammed into the man's jaw.
Sinong hindi na si Chani Bikbik, ako hindi nakalista.
The first trooper recovered
Dalawa.
his balance and ran at him. When the kid ducked his attacker's punch, he pivoted and threw a hard right to the attacker's temple. The trooper fell, but wasn't out yet. Brennan had recovered and stepped in, aiming a punch at the kid's face. The kid ducked under the blow, threw an uppercut at Brennan's chin.
Dalawa daw, gwapo sabi ni Kikay Kulit. It's me, Sarah, Mika Love, shout out.
Nicholson strode up to him and glared.
You're under arrest, Morgan. I won't have brawling among my men. You can't arrest me. I'm not a damn soldier. I told you this area.
Kalang Jonathan, saglit ha. It's me, Sarah, Mika Love, shout out. Kanino nga ba ako? Sharon. Tapos ako kay Chani Bikbik eh. Sharon.
Morgan threw the first punch.
Sharon
I didn't do
Cunita.
anything until Brendan grabbed me.
When we get back to Fort Bliss, the commanding officer will view your testimony and decide whether to seek civil charges against you. Until then, I'll take your gun, Morgan.
The kid
Sharon.
glanced around. There were close to 30 troopers, and while none of them held a rifle at the moment,
Tuwing ganitong oras na talaga ang live ko kasi ginagamit ng mga bata yung ano.
and anyone
Rochelle
who
Ann,
didn't want to
25 to
shoot back
28.
well, maybe one.
Ginagamit ng mga bata yung ano,
You
computer.
wouldn't be smart to take my gun when we're on the trail of 100 bloodthirsty Apaches, Lieutenant.
If we encounter the hostiles, I'll return your weapon.
How about if I give you my parole? That's what you army types call it, isn't it? I
Believe
swear
it.
not to use my gun against you. You don't push this until it's gone too far for either of us to back out. Deal?
Nicholson hesitated. He didn't want to back down. in
Rochelle
front of
Ann,
his men.
Rochelle
Yet
Ann.
the arrangement the kid had proposed did have some precedent.
All right. You give me your parole now, and we'll deal with your actions once we get back to Fort Bliss. It's acceptable.
Sino pa yun? Si Rochelle,
Even though he had no
Rochelle
intention of
Ann,
fighting
Jonathan,
Fort Bliss,
25,
Sub
28.
Lieutenant.
Bilisan magsulat. Si Jos Dan, 25 to 8. Saglit lang Diyos ha. Rochelle Ann.
Not much, though. We can't afford to lose it. We'll ride in 5 minutes.
He watched as several soldiers roused
Kay
Brennan
Rochelle
from
Ann
his
naman.
stupor.
Ay,
When
Rochelle
the
Ann, kay
sergeant
ano,
had wits about him
Jonathan.
again, he looked
Atay
over
na.
at the kid with a glare of pure hatred.
This ain't over.
I know.
Jonathan.
Nicholson pushed the patrol fairly hard all day, but by nightfall, they still hadn't caught up to the Apaches, or even caught sight of the war
Jonathan,
party's
sino
dust.
pa? Si Jos.
The kid spotted something interesting as gloom began to settle over the landscape.
Ilan kay Irene, day? Apat yung video, day, kay Irene.
He
Si
pointed
Jos
out the glowing
TV,
yellow pinpricks to Nicholson, who raised a hand to stop the patrol.
Is that the Apache
5
camp?
to 8.
Looks more like a town to me. I'd say it's probably one of those border settlements we talked about earlier.
And that's where we need to go. The people there can tell us how far it is to the border.
That settled the question of where the patrol would camp for the night, which was good. So far, the kid hadn't seen a really suitable place. Nicholson waved the troops
Ato
forward.
na, Jos.
As they drew closer, it became easier to see that the lights came through windows.
Ilan kay, ano, Sharon,
The
ilan?
settlement wasn't very big,
Dan po si
with a main
Irene
street
Marie.
running north and south that stretched for a couple of blocks. Some dwellings were scattered here and there. Even in the gloom, the kid could tell that all of them were constructed of a
Uy,
and
nakahabol
most were
din.
squat and square. One place in the first block had 2 stories, making it the biggest structure in town. A sign on the building read, Sago Hotel and Saloon.
Sago. You think that's the name of this settlement?
Either that or the name of the man who owns the place. Maybe even both. There's an easy way to find out.
Of course. Go inside and ask someone.
Nicholson turned in the saddle.
Sergeant Brennan, you and the men wait out here. You can dismount and allow the horses to drink at that water trough.
Nicholson pointed to a well that was situated in the middle of the intersection where the settlement's lone cross street bisected the main street. a windmill, an elevated water tank, and a long trough that could be filled from a spout attached to the tank were nearby. The setup reminded the kid of water stops he had seen along the railroads. That was an odd place to put a well, right in the middle of town like that, the kid mused. Then he realized the well had probably been there first, and the settlement had grown up around it. Water was
Irene
so
Marie,
precious in the mostly dry region
29 to
that such a thing was
32. Ah,
completely
okay, kape. Saglit lang, ha?
understandable. He and the lieutenant dismounted and looped their reins around the hitch rack in front of the hotel and saloon. The kid and Nicholson stepped onto the building's low porch. Instead of the bat wings found on most saloon entrances, this one had a pair of regular doors. Nicholson took the lead and opened one of them.
Nalista ko na yung isa, di ano na lang.
With his hand held close to
Tatlo
the
na
front
lang.
of his Colt, the kid moved into the room behind Nicholson and looked around. The long bar was in an L shape, starting on the right side of the room and running across the rear wall, ending where a staircase ascended to the second floor balcony. Tables filled the middle of the room, and along the left-hand wall was a gambling layout, including tables for poker, faro, keno, and blackjack, along with a roulette wheel.
Sharon.
No one was trying their luck at the moment. In fact, the saloon wasn't very busy. Only 2 tables were
29, 30,
occupied,
31,
and maybe a dozen
32.
men stood at the
Jonathan
bar,
ka talaga.
mostly drinks and mugs of beer. One
Jonathan.
white-aproned bartender was enough to tend to their needs.
Nakakalito.
The only
Hindi,
one
kasi
was a
alam mo naman yung
faded
mata ko.
blonde who wore a frilly dress
Kaya
and
ginanyan ko
tray
nga
in
eh,
her
para
hand as she
makita
stood at
ko
the
lang eh.
angle of the bar.
59 to
She
30.
had just delivered drinks to one of the tables. The men at the bar were a mixture of American cowboys
Jonathan
and
pa ako,
Mexican
kay Jonathan
vaqueros.
pa.
3 more vaqueros sat at one of the tables. All seemed to be getting along. The 4 men sitting at the other occupied table didn't look like the sort to be chasing cows. One of them was big and rugged, with a shock of coarse red hair under a thumbed-back Stetson. To his left was a man with a pale, narrow face and deep-set dark eyes. Across from the redhead, with his back to the kid so that his face wasn't visible, sat a man in a charro jacket and wide-brimmed felt sombrero with a
Jonathan,
colorfully
Rachel
woven
ako.
band.
Kay Rachel ka? Kay Kikay ako dara.
The 4th man,
Plus kabong may
redhead's right,
miga love.
was an
Shout out plus
Indian, but not
kabong.
Apache.
Salamat.
He wore high-top
Kay Kikay
moccasins,
ako dalawa.
buckskin trousers, and a loose homespun shirt with a blue sash tied around his waist. A blue headband held back his shoulder-length black hair. The kid would have been willing to bet the man was a Yaqui. He had met some of them over in Texas, at a place called Rattlesnake Valley. He took all that in with a
Plus
glance as
kabong.
he
Di
followed
pa,
Nicholson to
di
the
po
bar.
pa.
The
Perfect
apron
score.
came along the hardwood
Ilang
and gave him a
yan?
friendly nod. He was in his
Plus.
40s, thick body, with gray hair and the flushed face of a man who consumes too much of his own product.
What can I do for you, Captain?
It's Lieutenant.
Pabili toyo mayang. Dali.
This is Sago, New Mexico territory, Lieutenant. It's named after me.
Puntahan mo yung nakapin, Day Sharon, yung 1 to 5.
Founded the town.
Can you
Kung
tell
hindi
us
ka
how
pa dyan.
far it is from here to the Mexican border?
Did you see the well when you rode into town?
Of course, it would be difficult to overlook.
Well then, you've seen the border. That's it right there. Happenstance, mind you. I didn't set out to drill the well right on the line, but that's where I found water.
You mean the town sits directly on the border?
That's right. The south side of town is New Mexico. Of course, on a practical level, it doesn't really matter much.
Tani bik-bik din.
Folks go back and forth all the time. Nobody really cares which side of the line they're on.
I do. My authority stops at the border.
17 to
Your
20.
authority to do what, Lieutenant? If you don't mind me asking.
35.
We're in pursuit of a band of hostiles, Apaches. And they have 4
Saglit lang kay Han,
prisoners.
hindi ko pa nabasa yung sinasabi
The
mo.
kid watched
35.
the 4 men at the table from the corner of his eye as he said that.
36.
The tough-looking redhead's eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned forward a couple of inches in an instinctive reaction. The other 3 men cut their eyes at him, even the stocky Mexican, who turned his head enough
Sa
to look
mga
toward the bar.
28, si Jonathan lang at Arcel nagpunta mayang ah.
We heard some rumors around here about a bunch of Bronco Apaches coming over the border.
Si
But nobody
Rochelle.
in town seen hiding their hair.
Jonathan lang at sa si Rochelle Ann.
How can you be sure no one is seen?
Saan na yung
Because
iba?
everybody in this part of the territory comes in here sooner or later, Lieutenant. And I keep my eyes and ears open. It's the only real watering hole in these parts, and I'm talking about the well and
Ah,
the
mga
saloon.
maro.
War
Yan.
party's tracks.
Baklasin ko yan, mamaya kay, baklasin ko.
Around the town at the dark. It can't be that far behind. We can probably
Babaklasin ko mamaya yan. Titignan ko. Ito naman nakabukod naman oh. Kaya nga binubukod ko eh. Ayun oh.
Working as a civilian scout.
Nakabukod
But
yan.
you know perfectly well
Yung
that
mga
the
nagdandan ka ganina kasi alam ko yung binababang video.
Before, my authority ends at the
Sorry
border.
na lang. Kapag walang bakas. Kasi babaklasin ko dito, nakabukod yung mga papel.
There's nothing to talk about. It's over. We can't be nearby.
Sudan niya,
I've got several empty
hindi
rooms
ko lang
upstairs.
nagbakas.
That's the hotel
Oo.
business. You and
Titignan
Mr.
ko yan
Morgan
mamaya
are
eh.
gonna stay here, Lieutenant. No charge to the cavalry.
No. thank
Tama, Jonathan. Hindi yan mananalo pag ganyan.
you. Come on, Morgan. I thought I might stay
Mga
here.
nagdandan tapos hindi naman pala nagpunta.
Have you forgotten what occurred earlier?
Ano yan?
No, I gave you my word, and I intend to keep it.
Very well. I'll hold you to that. I have to go make sure none of my men have strayed past the well into Mexico.
You said you wanted a beer?
That's right. Do you have any food?
Tortillas, beans, and beef.
That sounds just fine.
Nakikita ko yan talaga si Jonathan. Si Jonathan, si Rachel Ann.
What was that the
Si
lieutenant
Jonathan,
said?
yan talaga. Ano talaga yan.
Nothing for you to worry about. Just a disagreement over tactics.
I didn't think officers had disagreements about tactics with civilians.
Neither did the lieutenant.
Hey, sit down wherever you want. I'll have Greta bring a plate of food to you.
Much obliged.
The kid dropped a $5 gold piece on the bar.
That buys you the hospitality of the house, Mr. Morgan, which includes Greta if you want.
I'll think about it.
He carried the beer over to one of the tables and sat down.
Maging honest tayo guys kasi pangit yung magsige tayo dandan tapos hindi naman pala
Without
totoo.
being too obvious about it. Conversations among the cowboys and
Pero hindi ko pa
vaqueros
nakita,
quieted
mamaya ko
once the
kasi
kids
ito
were
kasi
talking
hindi naman kasi ito
But it
ano eh.
started up again, most likely about
Sakit ng mga daliri ko.
war party in the area.
Hindi kasi ito ano eh, hindi kasi ito StreamYard eh.
But the
Dan
arrival of the
33 to
cavalry
36.
confirmed the
Hindi kasi ito
possible
ano yung
Of course, now that the Apaches were
direct
across
kasi
the
to.
border in Mexico, it was doubtful
Kaya
they'd
hindi ko
double
kayo
back
maano
and attack
mamaya
the
ko
town,
patitingnan
or
kaya nga
anywhere
binukod ko yung entry.
More than likely, the raiders had done all the
Mamaya
damage
ko yan
they
ibali
intended to
ano.
and just wanted to get back to their stronghold somewhere in the fastness of the Mexican mountains. The blonde had gone behind the
Huwag
bar.
tayong
and
ano
disappeared.
ba, huwag tayong
She
mangdaya.
emerged from a door carrying a couple of plates on her tray. and
Talon-talon
crossed to the
pa.
kid's table.
Here you are, sir.
She then set the plates on the
Kasi
table
ako
in
hindi
front
ako
of her.
marunong
One
ganyan
held a stack
daya-daya
of
eh.
tortillas, the other piles of beans and beef. Up close, the
Hindi
kid saw
tayo
that the
yaman
woman
pa
was
ganyan eh.
worried that he
Magdaya
saw.
tayo.
She was somewhere around
Gaba,
30,
abutin natin
old
dyan.
and working in a saloon. Tiny lines around her eyes and mouth indicated she had lived a hard life, but her blue eyes were clear and beautiful. The kid smiled up at her and slipped her another gold piece.
Your name is Greta?
That's right.
Thank you, Greta. I appreciate it.
She hesitated, holding the empty tray in front of her.
Mr. Sago said that if you stay here and you want some company.
Kahiya namang manalo tayo
There's
tapos
nobody
yung
I'd
pala
like
hindi
to get to know
totoo.
better. But I've been riding
Hindi
with
naman
that
pala
stuffed
nakabakas.
shirt lieutenant all day. To tell you the truth, it's just flat worn me out.
I understand. Enjoy your meal.
I intend
Grabe
to.
paghihiwa ni
He
Annalyn
turned
oh.
and started back toward the bar. Looking up from his food, the kid saw that the Mexican sitting at the table with the other three men had a hold of Greta's wrist and was trying to pull her onto his lap. His other hand roughly caressed her hip.
Oh, hell.
Greta continued trying to pull loose from the Mexican's grip as the kid pushed his chair back and stood up. At the bar, Edwin Sago frowned worriedly. Some of the cowboys and vaqueros began to sidle toward the door, obviously intent on getting out of there before any real trouble started.
Oh, what's the matter, Chiquita? You are quick to what the other
Ha?
man.
Kailangan nakasubscribe pa mayang. Yes! Bawal
You
yan eh.
just don't like stinking greasers.
Bawal
is
yan
that it?
i-remove ko.
You said it, mister, not her.
Valdez's head jerked.
Joshua Roquetera, late na naman siya.
As he
Si
did,
Sikoy! Salamat si Sikoy.
I don't like it.
Nabuang na ng tubag na itong taas.
the kid got a good
Hindi
look
ikaw,
at him
dito
the first
oh.
time. Valdez's face was dark and brutal and broad like his
Sagot ka
body.
man nandyan ka man sa
He
taas.
sported a thick mustache and heavy beard stubble.
You must run into a lot of trouble if you're always as much of a jackass as you're being now.
Listen, gents, I don't want any trouble here.
No trouble, senor. It will be no trouble at all.
His right hand flashed across his body and plucked a knife from a sheath on his left hip.
Umidlip kanina.
Damn gringo.
Akala ko tamsak lang. Hindi, kailangan i-subscribe mo, siyempre. Di mo yun oh.
The kid stayed put, and as soon as
Apat-apat lang
Valdez
yan.
was within reach, he brought his right foot up and
33
plunged
to
with a swift
36.
kick that sang the toe of his boot to
Lima
the
ba?
Mexican's groin.
Asa lima? Lima.
Valdez dropped the knife as he collapsed
1,
onto the floor.
2, 3.
The kid heard a
Tigbay ka,
person's
Jonathan,
dad
nanduduling mo na kami yung ginagawa mo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, o limang.
The kid knew he could beat the man's draw, but he didn't have to. The redhead moved fast and swept a leg around, knocking his
Ako,
companion's
aaminin
legs out
ko
from
kahit
under him.
maiksi lang comment ko, pupunta talaga ako eh. Ako nga rin, maiksi nga din ako pag comment eh.
As if asking him not to kill the man on the floor.
You saw what happened. Ruby brought this trouble on himself.
The man called Chess glared. His eyes flicked toward the revolver that lay a couple of feet from him, and for a second, the kid thought he was going to make a grab for it.
You're right, Kelly. Now, all right, mister. I'm going to pick up my gun and put it back in my holster. Don't get antsy.
I don't get antsy.
All through the confrontation, the Yaqui hadn't moved, except for his eyes. They had taken in everything, and the kid would have bet that if the Yaqui had needed to do anything,
Dalawa na lang ang hindi ko pa nababa. Nag-live pala to si ano?
Why don't you use your left
Jeswell,
hand? Just so nobody gets any ideas.
41.
Chess glared some more.
Jeswell na lang at saka si Bumbumban. Hindi pa nababa ko.
Dapat madikit rin. Then grasped the edge
Idikit
and
mo
pulled himself
rin,
to his feet.
siyempre.
The redhead, Kelly, Chess had called him.
Ganon yun,
smiled
Inday.
at the kid.
Sorry about the trouble. Ruby sometimes forgets he's supposed to be civilized now. He comes from so far back in the mountains.
Ganon sa YT, Inday, ganon.
And I don't suppose it would do any good to tell him to apologize to the lady.
Kasi mawawala yun pag hindi
Don't
ano.
do it on his behalf.
Kelly took his hat off. He looked at Greta, who stood nearby, looking frightened.
I'm sorry for my illegal's behavior now. I hope he didn't hurt you too much.
Greta lifted her hand and looked at her wrist, then rubbed it against the back of the other hand holding the tray.
No, I'm fine.
Ay, okay, sorry, back to zero. Hey, don't worry, I will do it
Ruby
again.
is a
Ha.
surprising sort. You forgive us then.
Of course.
Greta, come on back over here.
She went, casting a glance at the kid as she did so.
Pwede mo naman ano eh, habol mo, tapos send mo sa akin mamaya yung ano mo.
You could have killed Ruby.
Kung gusto mo humabol, puntahan mo lahat yung mga ano nila, tapos send mo sa akin. Pwede mo naman habulin. Wala namang problema.
For the first time, the Yaqui showed some reaction.
That one will walk funny for a week. Yeah.
Kelly gestured toward one of the empty chairs at the table.
Care to sit down and have a drink with us?
Kasi ako,
Morgan, was it?
iiwan ko na to eh.
Is it all right if I bring my supper with me?
Sure.
Gawa ng magluluto pa ako doon sa kabilang bahay.
Jess, why don't you help Ruby into a chair at one of the other tables?
Kelly tossed a coin to Chess, who had pouched his iron, but still stood tensely beside the table.
Buy him a bottle of mezcal.
Banjelin, maglista ka muna, mamaya ka na magsaing. Magluluto pa nga ako, sasaing ka na dyan eh.
Chess bent down with a show of surprise
ano
and
na yan?
strength, considering his slight frame. He hauled Valdez to
Ano
his
na
feet.
yung kanin?
With Chess supporting him, the Mexican waddled over to an empty table and sat
Ano ka
down.
muna, at pupunta pa tayo sa kabila.
We need another bottle of
Barbecue
glass
pa ako.
over here.
I'll bring it myself.
47.
Tego brought over the whiskey and a clean glass and took away the empty bottle that sat in the middle of the table. Kelly picked up the new bottle, pulled the cork from it, and splashed amber liquid
Ito
into
na,
the
last na
glass
to kay
and the kid.
Bumbimban eh.
Your friend's not drinking?
Mateo's an Indian, as I'm sure you can tell. He has a problem handling liquor. You wouldn't want to be around him after he's had a drink. We wouldn't want to. He and I have been amigos for
Last
a
na to
long
kay
time.
Bumbimban eh, wala na
Simon
iba.
B.K. Kelly, by the way. Here's to your continued health, Mr. Morgan.
He lifted his
Yun.
glass and tossed back the fiery
Si
liquor.
Jonathan, 38-40. Si Jaswell, 1 to 4, 1 to 4,
The kid
done.
wasn't, but he didn't
Sunny
say
Bekbek,
anything,
21 to
figuring Kelly was gonna tell him
24.
anyway. He busied himself with the tortillas, beans,
Sa mga
and meat.
gustong humabol dyan, alam nyo naman kung sino yung sponsor ko. Send nyo lang sa akin, pwede.
Fighting and wanting.
Pagbigyan ko ngayon kasi hindi ako pwede magtagal.
Filibuster.
Maglulot, iihi muna ako.
What he was doing when he met my mother. A beautiful Mexican señorita. A high-born lady, you understand. From a family who didn't want her marrying from some ragtag Irish mercenary. They wound up running away together, getting hitched by some village priest in the mountains. And you see the result of that union sitting here before you. Quite a dramatic
Pero hindi ko yan papatayin.
novel.
Kasi hahayaan ko lang yan siya. Hahayaan ko lang yan siya nakaon mamaya. Pagtapos ito, ngayon, at pag matapos ito, tusok na si Bumbimban. Salamat Bumbimban. 1720 done.
I don't know all that much firsthand. According to the lieutenant, 100 Apache warriors crossed the border from Mexico
Open
about
tab
a
ba?
week and a half
Hahaha,
ago and
oo.
started
Maganda
raiding
nga
north
pag
here.
open tab eh.
They hit some
Kasi
ranches
ano
and
eh,
are even supposed to have
mabilis
attacked
eh.
town. I don't know if that's
Kasi?
true or not, but I do know they wiped out a wagon train in a valley about 30 miles north of here. I saw with my own eyes what happened to those poor people.
A wagon train. I didn't know there were such things
DJ
anymore.
Pengnoy, 1720 dan po subscribe din. Sorry, kala ko mayang kamsak lang.
Poor women.
Know this for a fact.
When I came along,
Okay lang, Inday. Huwag mo nang i-ano yung subscribe dahil kasi papaluin ako ni Lulong Kunot. Bawal kasi yun isulat sa ano yung subscribe, bawal.
I knew the man who made it. I believe.
Well, it's a right shame for those poor women. They'll be treated roughly, but we already have to.
Probably.
There'll be no help for them, since the lieutenant made it clear he won't
Sharon
pursue the Apaches.
Oh, Sharon Sab.
Maybe they'll run across some
Apat
new
yung
routes.
kanya.
If the rurales see any
Okay lang. Siyempre, bago ka pa, hindi mo pa alam eh. Justwell Yahoo, sabi ni Bumimban.
you can depend on that. They want no trouble with the Apaches. They only hunt down bandits in the hopes of liberating.
Si Jonathan tapos na to, 38 to 40.
Thanks for the drink.
Sure you don't want another?
I'm sure.
He looked
Huli
over at the
binaba
other
si
where Guadalupe Valdez sat hunched over,
si Koy
sucking
Justwell at
greedily
saka
at the
si
bottom of the staff.
Bumimban.
The Mexican slanted his eyes toward the kid, and they were full of pure hatred. He could get in a long line of men who hated Kid Morgan. Without looking back, the kid headed for the door.
Namarang na naman siya.
He hoped Lieutenant Nicholson hadn't had the gun taken away with the other horses. If the horse was still tied up to the hitch rack in front of the saloon, the kid intended to mount up and
Harang,
head for the door.
salamat Jonathan. Dito ka nga muna dahil, sigarilyo lang ako dahil. Tapos ayusin ko yung mga timpla doon sa barbecue.
The gun was still there
Sulat mo
as the
dito.
reins looped around the hitch rack.
Ayun na naman siya, nagpapalito. 41, 42, 43, 44.
The kid stayed where he was for a second, then slowly lowered his hand away from the reins.
The lieutenant sent me to make sure you keep your parole.
barbecue
Since you got my word, you wouldn't keep your word. Thought you might try to get across the border and go after those hostiles.
I gave him my word I wouldn't use my gun against him or any of you troopers.
Yeah, I know. You thought you could slicker us that way, didn't you?
I already did.
Well, it's not good. Boy. You're still under
Yes.
arrest. boy.
Morning pa yan.
Untie your horse and come with me.
The kid hesitated. Brennan's rifle was ready, but even so, the kid knew he might be able to draw and fire before the non-com could get off a shot. But that would mean breaking his word.
Where's the camp?
Just north of town. Come on, quit
Yan
stalling.
o.
All right.
Ang
The kid
barbecuehin ko
untied
guys,
the gun's
ayan o.
reins
Eh,
and led the
sigarilyo
horse
ko.
on the street.
Oh,
Brennan
pagkain ni Busing.
thought the man
Inano ko na
created
kapag
behind him
ulam
was
namin,
going to
inano
use
ko
the
na to
skin
eh,
of that
pinalambot
dog.
ko na sabay barbecuehin. Ayan o, doon
Despite
sa kabila.
that, he didn't think Brennan would shoot him down in the middle of the street.
Dito ko
He
ilalagay.
saw that they were coming to a darkened alley between two buildings.
Wait a minute. Go through there.
Ribs.
Shortcut.
Thought you said the camp was north of town.
It is. Northeast. Go
Ang
on.
barbecue
Do like I told you.
namin, pinapalambot ko na
He knew what
bago
would happen if he started
i-barbecue.
down that dark alley. Brennan intended to shoot him in the
Ayaw
back,
niya nang
then
matigas
claim
sa
that he tried to
barbecue.
escape.
Dan sa 21
Lieutenant
to
Nicholson might be suspicious,
24
but he
kay
wouldn't be able to prove
Joshua,
that Brennan wasn't
Joshua
telling the truth.
Cafeteria.
Brennan's head jerked around toward the newcomer. The kid took advantage of the unexpected opportunity and dropped the reins. He lunged
Pwede na
at
nga to kainin kasi malambot na
Brennan.
to eh.
Grabbed the rifle barrel and wrenched it
Pero
sideways.
iihaw kasi masarap yung
Brennan
ihaw.
tightened his grip on the
Pero pag
weapon,
iyon
trying
ang
to
taga,
ram
hindi
the
na,
stock into the
hindi
kid's
na masyado
face.
yung
The
matagal.
kid had
Siyempre.
his other hand on the rifle's breech and
Luto na
stopped
eh.
the blow. The two men staggered to the side as they wrestled over the Springfield.
Balik
Brennan
ka lang
saw
sa
a
dulo
bullet between
niya,
the
way
kid's
sa
ankles
limot.
and tripped it.
Hindi ka tawag, balik.
Brennan fell with him and they rolled over and over.
Ayaw ko
He had an
subin, hindi
opportunity.
masarap.
Brennan
Subin.
pulled the trigger of the Springfield.
Hindi mo maamoy yung smoke na
Both
ano.
men froze for a second, but the kid recovered first.
Doon tayo sa
He ripped the rifle
terrace
out of Brennan's
mag-ihaw
hands
di.
and slashed out with the butt.
Bakas ilaw.
The kid felt bone crunch under the impact, and a surge of savage satisfaction went through it. But that satisfaction was tempered by worry. He had recognized the voice that called his name. It belonged to Greta, the blonde.
Yan,
saloon
mahabol
girl who
si
stayed
Koy.
with us. Brennan
Lima na
seemed to
siya.
be stunned,
Lima na.
so the kid
Oh,
tossed the empty
mahabol
rifle
kasi.
aside and leaped
Open
to his
tab yung
feet.
kanya eh.
He spotted the
Open.
crumpled form
Oh,
lying a few
naka-open
yards
tab
away
yan.
next to one of the buildings. Hurrying to
Thank you
her,
so
he
much.
dropped to a knee beside her and leaned over to see if she was still alive.
Are you hit?
He got an arm under Greta's
Mayas
shoulder
sumisay.
and lifted her head.
Mayas.
Ikay?
I'm not sure.
Naging apat
Sino
na
lumayas?
My side.
Oh.
Kaya ata kayo, wala ko
The
naman.
kid put a hand on her right side and found nothing. But when he moved it to the left, he felt the wet heat of blood soaking through her
Nandyan lang
dress.
yan. Ano yan? Hi, Kikay. Kikay pa, naka-open tab yan.
I have a friend who can take care of me.
You don't live at the saloon?
Pabalik-balik. Tanong po kay
I
Julia.
have a place
Ay, Julie.
on the south side of the
21,
settlement.
24, ayan.
Across the border, the kid thought, as he glanced at the well that marked the boundary. Sago had said people around there didn't pay much attention to it, so the kid wasn't surprised that Greta lived over the line. No one had come to investigate the shot. He supposed such sounds weren't that uncommon around there. If anybody was going to help Greta, it looked like it would have to be him. Moving carefully, he slid his other arm under her
Ayan,
knee,
yung
then
apat kay
straightened
Ate
to his feet,
Sharon.
lifting her and
Dami
praying
yung
on her
entry, oh,
against
kasi isang sponsor, apat
him.
na,
She hadn't looked particularly thin in the saloon.
apat na ano yan,
There
apat
was
na
a certain
video, hindi
fragility
nababa
to
ko
her
eh.
as he held her in his arms, almost as insubstantialness as if she were fading away. He clutched to the gun to indicate the horse should follow him.
25 to 28.
You'll have to tell me how to get to your place.
Greta gave him a weak nod and put her arms around his neck to help support herself.
It's on the edge of the settlement, to the southwest.
He looked back once and saw Brennan struggling to his feet. Once they reached Greta's home, the kid awkwardly worked the latch on the front door and carried her inside. She told him the bed was to the left. In the dark,
Hindi
he
pa
found
pala
her and
malulugan
lowered
din.
her onto the thin mattress. Then he stepped back and, still following her direction,
25,
found an
28
oil
dan.
lamp
Iba yung
stretched
bakas ko
elusively
kanina
from
sa
the
mga
pocket
nauna.
to light. The flickering yellow glow of the lamp expanded and filled the cottage's single room. It was sparsely furnished: a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, an old wooden trunk, and a battered and scarred wardrobe. The floor was dirt, and some shelves on one wall held a few supplies.
I'd better take a look at that wound and see how bad you're hurt.
He leaned over her. The blood stain on her dress was about a foot in diameter, but it didn't seem to be spreading.
No, I'll be all right. Vine Consuela, next door.
Sarap ng
Somehow.
sauce eh.
You need to go after those
Tikman mo sauce.
Apaches. That's what you were about
Pwede
to
na ulam.
do, isn't it?
I'm not going anywhere until I'm sure that you're all right. Except
Kalaway
for
sauce
Sister
lang.
Consuela.
Ayan
His
na.
long-legged strides took him to another small adobe
Just
call
well
next to Greta's
apart.
place.
Apat.
A worried-looking Mexican man opened the door.
Nauna ko ba kasi siya nang kagigising lang sa white cake agad.
The man's eyes widened.
Okay ra si Sikoy, ay.
He turned his head and spoke
Okay.
in Spanish.
Habol ka
He was
dyan.
able to follow enough of it to know that Consuelo
Habol,
was the man's
habol.
wife, and he didn't want her going anywhere with the strange gringo.
Oh, mayroon na may ilaw.
Consuelo appeared and pushed past her husband.
Habol lang,
with little
habol.
Where is she? At her house?
The kid nodded and waved a hand in that direction.
Di kasi ako makawaiti pag ano eh, hindi hapon eh, kasi ginagamit computer mga bata, inis na eh. Wala tayong magagawa eh. Ano eh, anong tawag yan? Module. Oh, ayun na, hindi na siya dikit-dikit. Dan si Jonathan sa 45, 46, 47, 48. Yun yung huli kong babae. Kay Bumbimban.
Sensing that she had a certain shyness about her, despite the fact that she worked in a saloon and sold herself to men. In other surroundings, though, she wasn't that way. He was more than willing to honor that and not intrude. A few minutes later, Edwin Sago hurried across the border toward the house.
Greta, is
Yan na, apat
she
yan.
all right?
I don't know. I don't think she's
Apat.
hurt too bad, but I'm not sure about that.
What the hell happened? I heard a shot outside a little while.
Yung may
after
mga
you
extra
left.
dyan guys ha, pag alis namin guys, patambay naman dyan. Sabay ganun eh. Pwede naman ah.
Firing a gun into the air.
It was the sergeant.
Patambay sa mga may mga extra
Trying to kill
dyan.
me because of a run-in we had.
Magluluto lang kami eh.
Cavalry after you now?
Maybe, but I'm on the other side of the border.
Namumula kasi yung bilat ng white tea ko eh.
The kid tensed.
Kainis.
He caught sight of 4 men riding south along the
Dugo.
street, past the line
Nire-regla.
to Mexico. They galloped past Greta's cottage, never slowing down. The kid recognized them in the moonlight. Enrique Kelly and his
Ako pa
3
doon,
friends.
sugod ta.
They were on their way somewhere.
Ganiha, ano human
You know
dito,
about those
sa
men,
kurasa.
Sago?
Not a blasted thing except they're
Dan Mami Stone sa Bumbimban. Ilan yun?
I've
Apat?
never seen them
Apat.
before that. Not what the bunch though.
That they are.
A step in the doorway made him swing around sharply.
The bullet just grazed for Greta in the side. She bled enough to make her sick and weak, but the bleeding is stopped now and I cleaned the wound. I will make it
29 to 32 Dan. Habol ako. Mabol ka na.
You know
Aga pa naman eh.
She should not need much, only care. You wish to see her?
I do.
Hanggang ano, 6:30 tayo, 6:30.
Kuya, bumbimban, apat.
But she works in his saloon. She,
Si Sikoy, ano.
I suppose you're right.
The kid turned to look toward the center of town as hoofbeats rumbled in the night. He saw a dark mass of riders.
Nababa ko na lahat yung
They
sponsor
came
ko
to
eh.
a stop on the other side of the well. One of the
Habol lang kayo,
horsemen
scroll
separated
nyo
himself
lang,
from the others
scroll
and
nyo
rode
lang.
forward slowly, halting when he came
Hintayin
near
ko
the
kayo,
waterfront.
habol kayo. Scroll nyo lang.
Morgan, I see you down there.
You better go back inside and keep Sago there. Hector, take your kids and go home.
Senor.
It'll be all right.
Oh,
That's
ayan,
right, I wish you the
Ate
best.
Justwell, apat.
Morgan!
Apat na video kasi yan, isang sponsor kasi hinabol ko yan, gawa ng isang buwan walang live.
Captain, I didn't use my gun against you or any of your men.
You broke Sergeant Brennan's jaw,
Yeah, but I used his rifle to do it.
and you've illegally crossed the
Dalawa,
border
dalawa,
to
dalawa.
Mexico.
I never promised I wouldn't do that.
Morgan, I'm
Apat na
calling you to come
apat
back
apat
across
yan.
the line and surrender. If you don't, you can consider yourself a fugitive from the
Habol
United
pa.
States
Pwede
Army.
naman, pwede pa.
Sorry, Lieutenant. I'm going after those Apaches. I've got some captives to rescue.
You're insane!
This isn't the first time I've been accused of that.
You know I'm prohibited from crossing the border to pursue you,
The kid reached for the gun's reins.
So long, Lieutenant.
but I think I can stretch a point and allow my men to fire across the border.
The kid's eyes widened in surprise. He lunged for the gun. and
33,
grabbed the horse's
36,
reins.
done.
Nicholson
Ah,
fired
grabe.
open fire.
Nanakit yung finger mo
He
niya
was
natin.
pretty sure it was against Army regulations for Nicholson to cross the border. Shooting over the line was probably prohibited too. Luckily,
Naka-open tab
accurate
siguro
shooting was
yan siya.
almost impossible.
Oo, sabay kanina nga pala sabi niya open tab siya.
Rapidly fell behind him. He was confident Nicholson wouldn't come after him. That was one less thing he had to worry about. All he had to figure out was how one man was going to take 4 prisoners away from 100 bloodthirsty Apaches without getting killed in the process.
Ayun na.
The kid rode for a couple of miles, steering southward by the stars before he stopped.
Kaya
He didn't
dito
want to
lang
go
sa
too far
gilid.
in case he had to backtrack to pick up the trail of the Apaches. Looking back, he could still see the lights of Sago in the distance. He thought about Greta and hoped she would be all right. He seemed to have a good friend in Consuelo, and according to the Mexican woman, Edwin Sago loved her and would help care for her, so she probably stood a good chance of pulling through. He couldn't find it in him to regret doing that. The sergeant had been asking for it. The kid looked around until he found a little hollow ringed by mesquite bushes.
Arang! Mega mega love, shout out.
Since he had
Inday
eaten that himself,
Janice.
he didn't have to worry about a fire.
Hello, Banje. Miss you, Ate Mayang. Hello. Salamat. 29:32 si Chani Bitbit Dan.
Ngayon lang kita nakita, te.
The sun wasn't up, but the eastern sky was gray and the stars were fading overhead. He looked toward Sago, where a few lights glowed in the homes of early risers. He supposed Lieutenant Nicholson and the rest of the patrol would start back to Fort Bliss. Hunkered on his heels, the kid built a small fire out of mesquite branches and boiled some coffee. He had some supplies from the wagon train left.
Busy kayo, daghang event. Maojod.
Together with the salt pork, they made a decent
37 to 14. Dan! Ha? Dali.
Urak yun.
Saddled the gun and let it out of the mesquites. The
Kay
sun still
Ate
wasn't up.
Chane.
The brilliant orange
Apat.
glow on the eastern horizon told him it soon would be. There was enough light to see by, so he swung up into the saddle. The Apaches hadn't
Kay Ate
paraded right
Janice
through
isa.
Sago.
MLS o Ma'am Janine, sabi ni Chani Bitbit.
Sa Ate Justwell.
The kid rode back toward the border, angling toward the east. He spent more than an hour riding
5 to
back and forth
16, habol
before he
ako.
finally came across the
Pababa.
camps of the war party about a mile west of the settlement. The sun was
Yung
up,
ano,
the day was growing
yung nakapin sa taas, tapos ka na dyan si Sikoy,
The
Jaswell.
kid rode another hour before he reined in sharply and lifted his head. 3 shots, spaced close together like that, were
Oh,
undoubtedly meant
nabuang
to be a
naman sa
signal.
tuluan mo ni ko
The
sa
fact that
suso.
no more
Latay.
shots followed was a good indication of that.
Tapos ka na sa nakapin sa 1 to 5. Ay, 1 to 5 nga ba yun? O, 1 to 4 pala.
Judging from the tracks he'd been following, they were all sticking together. He thought
Habol
about
daw
Enrique
siya.
Kelly, Chess,
Kalang
Valdez,
ha.
Mateo. They had ridden out of the border town
Ano
the
na,
night before,
okay na siya.
heading in the same general
Kay ano
direction.
yung ano eh, pangalawa
A
eh.
signal like that usually meant a search of some sort. Had Kelly and the others been looking for something? The trail of the Apache war party, maybe? The shots probably meant they had found it. The kid pressed on. If Kelly and the other men were ahead of him, he would deal with that when and if it became a problem. For now, his attention was still focused on following the trail.
6.
Since he had started trailing the war party,
Kalang,
he had
saglit
worried
lang,
that he would come
saglit.
across the mutilated body of at least one of them. If the Apaches tired of their captives, it was entirely possible that they would just cut the women's throats and leave them behind for the buzzards. For that reason, the kid kept glancing at the sky, fearful he would see the carrion eaters circling. So far, that hadn't happened. But the kid wondered how long the
Si
prisoners
Diyos,
left would
25,
hold.
26,
The
27.
kid could see mountains ahead and to
Eight.
the west of him, but the trail led through country that could only be described as desert. He saw a few snakes, lizards, and giant hairy-legged tarantulas, but those were the only signs of life. By midday, his shirt was sodden with sweat, and he had started looking for a place that offered a little shade.
Bumbimban,
where he had
45 to
begun to wait
48.
out the hottest
Kuya,
part of the
Bumbimban.
day. He found it in
Ayan,
a
ang
small
dami pa
arroyo,
kasi. Si
and
Diyos,
the seat grew on the edge of it,
si
and the
Diyos,
space underneath the tree
Diyos,
had been
sunod si
hollowed out
Kikay,
by the
sunod
very
si
occasional flash
Sharon.
floods that ran through there.
Binaba ko lang yung 5 to
Despite the
6 to
kid's
8
intention
kasi
to stay
hahabol
awake,
si
in the
Sikoy
heat, it was
Jaswell.
almost impossible not to doze off. With his back against the wall of the arroyo and his hat tilted forward over his eyes, he drifted into slumber.
Kikay.
Sometime later, he wasn't sure
9 to
exactly how long,
8.
although the sun was still up. He was awakened by what sounded like a gun battle.
Dito ka
Again, he
tumingin.
thought about Kelly and the other men
Para
who'd
hindi
ridden
ka
out of saving.
mahirapan.
If they were looking for trouble, they must have found it. The kid got to his feet, untied the gun's reins from the
Yan ka
mesquite
tumingin.
roots that protruded from the
Para
arroyo
ibaba
wall,
ko
and
dito.
mounted up.
Running.
In the big empty landscape, it was going to be hard to sneak up on anybody. Suddenly, after another mile,
Hahabulin daw
the
ni
ground almost fell
Jaswell.
out from under him with no warning.
Kikay,
Whoa! He
Sharon.
reined in and stared at the deep canyon that slashed across the barren earth in front of him. The canyon was
9.
50 or 60 feet wide and at least 100 feet deep. It stretched as far as the kid could see in both directions.
Uy,
The walls were
di ka
perpendicular
na
to the floor of the canyon, or close enough to it. Only a fly could climb up and down it. Except where the Apache Trail led, a narrow ledge zigzagged its way to the bottom, then up to the other side. The ledge was wide enough for one man on horseback, maybe two if the riders were brave or foolhardy enough. The kid couldn't tell at first glance if it was natural.
11.
Something about it struck him as man-made, as if someone had carved the ledge with the rocky walls. It might be the only place for miles where a man could cross the canyon without having to ride around it for a day or more. The Apaches must have known about it. They had
12.
ridden straight to this spot, even though the kid didn't see any
That
landmarks
29 si
that
Bumbimban.
guided them.
Akin pala yun.
Left his gun with reins dangling, knowing the horse was unlikely to bolt. He pulled the Winchester from its sheath and levered around into the chamber. Carrying the rifle, the kid moved forward cautiously.
Doon na Hilario, si Sharon, Dan.
The great declivity. Puffs of gun smoke told him where the shots were coming from.
Dan, sa
The ledge on both
29
sides
si
was littered with
Bumbimban,
slabs
Dan.
of rock that had sheared away from the canyon walls in ages past and toppled onto the trail, creating obstacles, but also places where men under fire could take cover. That was obviously what had happened. About halfway down on either
Just
side of the
ano yung
canyon, two groups
5
of
to
riflemen
16,
crouched
ayan na.
behind those rocks and took pot shots at each other. The group on the opposite side was slightly higher than the men on the side where the kid was, giving them a small advantage. Their numbers were also greater. Shots were coming from 8 different places over there. And when the kid bellied down and risked a look over the rim on his side, he saw only 4 men under attack.
41 to
2 to 1
48.
odds. The men on his side of the canyon weren't strangers.
You didn't like
From
it?
up there, he could see behind the rocks where they were crouched. He recognized
Ah,
Enrique
okay.
Kelly, Lupe Valdez, the man called Chess, and the Yaqui, Mateo. Except for brief glimpses, the rocks on the opposite ledge concealed the riflemen over there. The kid caught sight of leggings, blue and red shirts.
Perfect na si Bakikay. Tapos na si Bakikay.
No doubt about it. The kid edged the Winchester's barrel over the rim rock. He nestled his cheek against the smooth wood of the stock, peered over the barrel, and lined the sights on a slab of rock where he had seen one of the Apaches poke his head up for a second a few moments
45 to
earlier.
48, Dan.
The Apache, who had unwisely lifted his head, flew backward as the kid's steel
Oo naman,
jacket
ako ba ba?
poured through his skull
Sana-
and exploded out again in a pink, grisly shower of blood, brain matter, and bone fragments. The dead warrior's body hadn't hit the ground by the
Ikaw
time
na
the
talaga,
kid
Kai.
shifted his aim and honed in on another rock. The Apache kneeling behind it, evidently startled by his companion's sudden death, twisted around to look at the bloody corpse. That Apache went down and lay still.
MLS ukol sa mga nag-mention siya na naghahabol si Rakitera.
They were under attack from above. They lifted their rifles and started peppering the rim rock with slugs.
Madali lang naman kasi pag open top.
They lay there for several moments,
Mabilis lang.
using the opportunity to thumb fresh cartridges through the Winchester's loading gate.
Wala na?
The rifle's
Alam mo,
magazine
gupit na ubos na? Dami kong ginupit kanina eh. Sige, magsulat
The
ka na ko na.
Apache seemed to have gone back to shooting at Kelly and the others. If they had left one man,
Habang nagpapa-entry ako kay Ayang eh. Na ano ko yan, ginugupit ko kanina.
he had forced himself not to flinch and pulled the trigger.
Dami na.
An instant later, he saw his attacker fall lifeless to the ground. Now that the kid had personally accounted for almost half of the ambushers, the pendulum had swung the
Apat-apat
other
kung
way.
binaba ko eh.
He pulled back a
Video
little
nila.
and watched as Kelly and his friends picked off the other Indians, one by one. Enrique Kelly was the first to break the silence.
Hey, whoever's up there on the rim, we sure as hell saved our bacon, mister.
The kid moved forward so he could look down at them. The men had emerged from their cover behind the rocks, but Chess and Mateo still had their rifles trained on the opposite wall, just in case any of the Apaches were clinging to life and tried to resume the fight. Kelly and Valdez peered up to the rim, each man using a hand to shield his eyes.
Josh TV. Josh TV.
Valdez jerked his Winchester to his shoulder. Before Valdez could fire, Kelly's hand shot out, grabbed the rifle's barrel, and forced
Moving
it
back
down.
down
Quick,
33.
it's your forward. Morgan probably saved our lives just now.
Kelly pulled the rifle out of
Yeah,
Valdez's hands.
Morgan,
Your entry.
come on down.
The kid's instincts told him not to trust these men, but if he was going to convince them to help him free those
Moving back
captives,
show.
he had to make them
Side
think that he
entry
did.
33.
He waved his rifle over his head.
I'll get my horse.
He picked up his hat, slid the Winchester back in the saddle boot, and took
Si
it down
Josh,
the range.
33, 34,
It would be
35,
easier and probably
36.
safer to lead the horse down the ledge than to ride.
Baka hindi nyo napuntahan yung nakapin sa taas kaysa puntahan nyo
The
guys.
others had already resumed their descent rather than waiting for him. By the time he reached the bottom of the canyon, Valdez and Mateo had gone over to the bodies of the Apaches who had
Sa
fallen off the
Joshua
ledge,
Rakitera,
making sure the
5
warriors
to
were
8
dead.
tan. Buti wala tupak.
Even though it was
Yung
highly
lapi,
unlikely any of them had survived
nakisama.
the fall on top of being shot. Kelly and Chess stood waiting with the horses near the base of the trail.
When somebody started shooting from the rim rock,
Hindi
I had a
malag.
hunch it was you, Morgan. I knew you weren't going to pay any attention to that stiff-necked lieutenant. You're still on the trail of those Apaches, aren't you?
That's right. From the looks of things, you are too. You followed the tracks here, didn't you?
That's right. We've got reasons to take care of.
The kid glanced across the canyon's sandy floor. Valdez was hunkered on his heels next to one of the bodies. The kid frowned as he saw sunlight reflect
Ayan
off
po yung
steel.
ano.
What's he doing?
Kelly glanced over his shoulder at Valdez.
Buti walang tupak ang lapi, nakikisama.
Valdez straightened from the corpse with something dark hanging from his hand. He held it out toward Mateo.
Valdez just scalped that man, didn't he?
That's the only way to collect the bounty the Mexican government pays for dead Apaches. Got to have the scalps to prove it. We made some money here today. Not a whole lot, mind you, but it all adds up.
You
Hindi
scalped
ko
him.
pala nagbaba ng bahay ko, kamatay.
So different from exterminating
Buang,
any
wala
other
man lang
kind
kahit
of
isang
bird.
video sa akin.
The kid was aware that Kelly
Magpa-tamsak
was
din ako
watching.
sa akin, kahit isa man
Well, the
lang.
man had seemed friendly enough so far, and it stopped Valdez from shooting at him. The kid saw something cold and intent in Kelly's eyes. A lot was riding on how he reacted.
Valley, huh? Well, I killed 4 of those ones, so I'll expect my share.
Oh, what I tell you, Chess. I told you that if we ran into Kid Morgan down here below the border, we ought to ask him to throw in with us.
You know who I am?
Well, I wasn't sure, but you said your name was Morgan, and I thought I remembered hearing about a fellow who's supposed to look like you. I know a man who's fast on the draw when I see one, and you're not anywhere near old enough to be that other Morgan, the one they call the Drifter.
The people will forget about him, but they'll remember me. Are you serious about wanting me to join forces with you?
Oh, damn right I'm serious. That's a damn big bunch of redskins we're going after. We can use some help, especially from a man as good with a gun as you are.
Even with the ones we killed here, that war party still has 85 or 90 men in it. I'm not sure one more gun on your side is going to make much of a difference.
It would if we took him all at once. But my plan is to cut a few out of the bunch at a time. Also, I've got a pretty good idea where they're going. If we can get ahead of them, maybe we can set up an ambush on our own.
You know where their stronghold is?
Dale's got a pretty good idea. That's not where the Apaches will be going first. I knew that as soon as you mentioned those female prisoners they have back in that border settlement. I don't understand. The Apaches won't be that interested in keeping the women. The fact that they haven't already killed them, down the bodies, tells me they've got something else in mind. They're taking them to Alberto Guzman.
Who's that?
Biggest slaver in this part of Mexico.
Taking the scalps obviously had cheered him up, but Valdez still wasn't happy when he found out the kid was throwing in with them.
You can't trust this man, gringo.
Yes, and I are gringos.
See, but that's different. These won't keep me lejones.
You're drawing out
Yan.
on him. Good shot you.
Si Big 33 to 36 done. Si Jos 37, 38, 39, 40. 9 to 12
Deal as
done.
usual. Now that we've got all that squared away, let's get moving. I don't want those savages to get too far ahead of us.
Valdez stored the scalps away in a canvas sack he hung on his saddleboard. From the ugly, faded brown stains on the sack, the kid could tell that it had been used for that purpose in the past, probably often. They led their horses up the ledge on the south wall of the canyon. Valdez and Mateo stayed behind to scout the Apaches who still lay dead on the ledge at the site of the ambush.
They'll catch up to us. It won't take long for Lupe to lift those heathens' hair. We get plenty of practice.
When they reached the top, the kid, Kelly, and Chess swung into their saddles and rode south.
I
Still
know.
following the
Taswell
war
na tayo.
party's trail.
Taswell sa 14 to 16.
Less than a quarter hour later, Valdez and Mateo galloped up from behind to join them. The sack bulged even more, and fresh bloodstains were soaking through the canvas.
Tell me more about this Guzman hombre.
Sure. Like I told you, he deals
Wait,
with
only one.
slaves. Indian, Mexican, white, it doesn't matter. As long as somebody's willing to pay, Guzman can supply the merchandise. Say you own a
I get
mine
that.
in the mountains, you want some cheap labor to work it. Guzman gets you all the Indians you want. Once you pay him, the only cost for that labor is a little bit of food.
Boom, boom, bang.
The mine owners worked them and starved them to death.
Fair. If there's one thing there's plenty of in this world, it's poor Indians. But say you own a whorehouse. Some of your customers have a liking for young girls. Really young girls. Guzman's your man. We can find Mexican families who can spare an extra mouth or two and we eat it. Or if we can't find any who are willing to sell their meat, we can always just steal.
The youngest of these captives I'm looking for is 17 or 18.
Salamat sa lahat. Kapi-kapi tayo later. 34, 35, 36. Bombi man. Humahabol, oh. 14, 16 si Sikoy. Hindi ko ba nababa yung 14, 16? Hindi ka lang. Ah, 13.
What's he going to trade for them?
Rifles, maybe, ammunition, liquor, whatever the savages want.
It sounds like he does all this
Doon,
out
oh,
in
doon
the
ka. Para makita mo dyan.
That's pretty much true. Most folks in northern Mexico know about this.
Why haven't the rurales gone after him? Is there something funny?
You just don't know. The
Third,
reason the Morales
10,
haven't gone after
13.
Bruce, he's Captain of Morales. He's the commander in charge of this whole district.
Kid tried not to stare. He had known the rurales had a bad reputation, but he hadn't expected that an outright criminal was in charge of them in these parts.
Do you think the Apaches are headed for Guzman's headquarters?
Oh, I'm sure of it.
Where's that?
The Morales barracks are in a village called San Diego,
Then,
mountains southwest of here. Mateo thinks the Apache stronghold is in the same direction, only deeper in the mountains. They can stop and make their deal with Guzman where they are.
That sounded
Nah.
reasonable and plausible to the kid. The scalp hunters stopped from time to time to rest their horses, but not for a meal. They gnawed pieces of jerky while they were in the saddle. Kelly shared some of his with the kid.
The least I can do, seeing as how you helped us out back there.
The trail continued south, even though Kelly had set it with angle toward the mountains when they got closer. In the middle of the afternoon, the five men came to a broad wash clearing to the southwest. Kelly reined in and pointed
isard ko muna to.
even though the
Isard
parts of
ko.
the war party
Isard.
continued almost due south.
Isard.
That's the route we'll take. It's a shortcut to the foothills. With any luck, it'll put us ahead of the Apaches.
What if they don't go the way you think they're going to? We'll have to double back. None of this cost us time.
You don't know, Terry. His plans are never wrong.
I appreciate that vote of confidence. not always right, but I've been tracking down those savages long enough. You can trust me on this, Ryan. They won't keep going south. There's nothing in that direction except badlands. But in the mountains, there are villages and farms and haciendas they can raid, along with Guzman's headquarters. That's where they're going.
The kid realized he had no choice but to go along with Kelly's plan. Working with these men,
41, 42,
no matter how
43,
repugnant he
44.
found them, still gave him his best chance
tapos
of
na.
rescuing the prisoner.
Fine. You're the boss, Kelly. Now that's what I'd like to hear. Come on.
It didn't take long for the kid to realize why the Apaches hadn't taken that route. The bottom of the wash was littered with rocks and gullies and clumps
49,
of brush.
53 done.
The riders had to weave around the obstacles, and it was slow going.
Are you sure this is going to save us some time?
Count on it. I know it's slow, but this way is 10 miles shorter. Also, we're deep enough into Mexico now that the Apaches won't be in any hurry.
Those bushwhackers they left behind don't come back. They may start to work.
Not for another day or two.
Are we going to get where we're going before it gets dark?
No, but that's all.
Just will to.
We'll reach the foothills sometime tomorrow morning.
Just
Probably
wow.
won't get there until the middle of the day.
Jonathan. Ayun na naman siya. Isa, dalawa, tatlo,
All the
apat,
kid could
lima.
do was hope that Kelly was right.
Wala naman, Jonathan. Kadali ka no. Ang laki na ng panalunan, Jonathan. Diyos ko, ginawa ko, Jonathan. Saan? Kay ano? Kay Sky, kay ano ata yun? Kay Ma'am Jiljon ata yun? Kay... Hindi ko lang matandaan. Basta ang laki. 2,000 ata yung
It was
higit.
too dark to go on through the rugged
Laki
arroyo.
ng mga panalo nila. Grabe sila.
Since they were down where flames couldn't be seen for miles around, Kelly declared it was all right to build a fire. So
Pero
they
ako
had
talaga,
hot
mas malaki
meat.
akin.
The kid shared the
Worth
last
of
of his salt
8,000 yung akin eh.
As they sat around
Pero
the dying
namuhunan
fire
man ako
drinking
doon.
coffee,
Namuhunan ako ng
Valdez got a bottle of
200.
tequila from his saddlebags.
200. Namuhunan ko. Rapol kasi yun.
Valdez poured some of the fiery liquor in his cup.
Ayan na, 5. 5.
That's fine. Not much cotton to that cactus juice anyway.
I prefer Irish whiskey myself. I have a bottle in my saddlebags, kid, if you'd like a taste.
No thanks. Anytime there's a chance I might be attacked by a bunch of howling savages, I'd rather have a clear head.
Those Apaches don't have a clue where he is.
I wouldn't be so sure about that. We were careful enough to set up that ambush in the canyon. They're bound to know about this shortcut. Maybe they split their forces again and sent some men this way just to be sure nobody tries to use it to get ahead of them.
Morgan might be right, Kelly. Maybe we should have built this fire. It'll be out soon. And setting up that ambush at the canyon was different. The savages are cunning enough to do that. They won't think about setting up a trap in this wash.
It still might be a good idea to stand guard.
And that's exactly what we're going to do. We would have anyway. It never hurts to be careful.
That allowed Kelly to save face, the kid thought.
Done. Bingo.
He didn't have any wish to
13,
challenge
14,
Kelly for
15,
leadership
16.
in this
Habol
bloodthirsty
talaga siya.
gang of scalp hunters. Each of the 5 men
37,
agreed to take a
38,
2-hour
Chanibik
turn
Bay.
standing watch. Kelly decided the
Kahabol
order
doon.
of the shifts, and again, the kid didn't argue. He was given the 3rd shift.
Si
the
Diyos
deepest,
naman,
darkest
45,
hours of the
46,
night.
47,
Even
48.
though he wasn't a frontiersman by
Secretary,
birth,
kaya pa ba?
he's spent enough time out there in recent years to
Aba,
develop
kanina
any
nga eh.
success of one.
Na ano rin yung
Most of the
kamay
time,
ko
he
ah.
dropped off to sleep easily and quickly when he had the
Full
chance.
pack done, just
When he woke
well.
up, he was fully
41 to
alert as soon as he
44.
opened his
Sabi
eyes.
ni Bumiman.
Just as
Arcon
he
Vlog,
turned
mega
the
mega love shout out to you
The
sir.
man knelt
Arcon
beside the kid and pulled
Vlog.
back a hand from touching his shoulder.
Shake. Patusok po ang host. Guys, tusukin nyo si Sir Arcon guys. Yung masarap-sarap na tusok guys ha.
That was
Huwag
good.
yung masakit na tusok guys.
The kid stood up.
Apply na ako.
buckled up his rifle.
May klase kasi yan kanina, kaya ako lang
The
mag-isa.
kid walked over to where the horses were picketed and turned his head
Kanina.
to take a look around.
Siya muna ngayon.
Light from the stars and a 3/4
Kaya
moon
mo ba o
scattered
dalawa
across the
tayo?
wall.
Ay, wala pa.
There were a lot of thick shadows. He searched those shadows
Kahit
for
siya ni
moonlight,
Bikbik ka na.
but didn't see any.
37, 38 lang,
The
dalawa
kid
lang yung
whirled
kanya.
toward the sound. as
Ah,
something
Johnny?
launched
Oh,
off the
eh
top
no,
of the bank,
37, 38 lang
blotting
yun.
out the stars like a giant bird of prey. The kid's razor-sharp reflexes saved him. He twisted aside,
Bumibban,
dropping the rifle in his
apat.
hands. The Winchester's barrel reflected the knife aimed at his throat.
Yung makilala mo sa akin si Sikoy.
The kid managed to
Pag ano, pag nagpunta na yung asawa ko doon, yung anak niya yun, anak niya, 20, ba, 25, 26 edad. Anak niya. Isa lang anak niya, wala asawa eh. Bumbimban, isa pa lang yan. Apat yan.
Mateo fought the invaders on their own terms, gliding through the shadows like a pheasant. The knife in his hand flicked out, pierced the heart.
Okay, yun.
There were more Apaches
Guwapo.
on the bank, and they stopped trying to engage.
Argon, dikit kalimbang sa'yo, tamsak dan. Sabi ni si Sikoy Jaswell. Agoy, ang bata pa pala. Hindi ko sure ha, basta parang wala pang 30. O 30, 30 or 31, mga ganyan. Hindi, basta hindi ko sure, basta hanggang 31. Hindi ko lang alam kung sasabay. 37 na ako ha.
Apply na ako.
Taya, uy. 45 to 49. Sabi ni Bumbipan na, saan ka na banda ba, Je?
45.
Ah, 45. Kay Bumbimban? 41 to 44. Tapos, ano na, nalista mo na yan? May bago na naman, ayun oh.
Kaya nga, o, dan
45 to 49.
ako.
Ah, okay.
Morgan?
37 na ako, ha. Si ano, si Kikay, 49 to 53.
O, sunod dyan.
Chess, stir up the fire and see if there are any embers left. Don't worry, Lupe.
O, di akalain mo na, kadalawang oras din ako. Magdadalawang oras, 10 minutes. Tama, makahabol pa kayo dyan. Kasi papatayin ko na lang, hindi ko na lang isa-silent kay. Ako ay habol ko pa. Habol ka lang. Diyan, dali, habol ka. Ano sa tingin mo kay? Papatayin ko to mamaya o hayaan ko lang nakaganyan?
Well, I wouldn't.
Okay, kay.
You're the best man with a knife we have. Well, when it comes to taking an Apache's hair, anyway.
Don full pa kay Sir Arcon Vlog. Sabi ni Jonathan Consuelo.
Alright. Chase, do what you have to do.
Habol mga sisi. Road to 100 tayo. Yes. Yes, yo.
Washing away the blood.
Chana Big Big. Danport 1.
Sawbones would probably
Pwede
stitch that up.
yung sisikoy lagyan sa description ng mga link.
Mateo put a hand on Chess's shoulder
Ha?
and made a motion with his head to indicate that Chess should step aside.
Aba.
Don't let that loco Indian near me.
Pwede ba
He
yun?
just wants to help you.
Yeah.
Pagkaalam ko hindi ata pwede eh.
Mateo's lips moved a fraction of an
Bahala ka dyan. Buhay mo matanda ka na. Giatay ka talaga.
After Valdez had downed several healthy slugs of the
Asar yan siya sa akin kagabi.
and wrapped clean strips of cloth around it, knotting them tightly in place.
Asar na, asar wala ni eh. Hindi ako binabasa ng giatay. 7 million people in the house. Thank you so much. Pwede si
Mateo
Sikoy.
went with him and stood guard
Pwede
while
daw.
Valdez went about his grisly work,
Saan ba? Saan
stuffing
dito?
scalp
Sa
after scalp into the canvas bag.
Ha?
While that was going on,
Iwan ko, di ko rin alam.
Chess underground fire.
Chat mo kamaya kung ano ang wala. Sige, Inday, chat kita. Pasa ko na lang sa'yo lahat ng sponsor para puntahan mo na lang.
There were at least.
Tapos ililista ko.
At least. I'm sure about that.
Picturean ko lang, tapos ano mo dyan, basta 4 na video ang bakasan mo. Tapos chichik upin ko na lang mamaya. Pasa ko sa'yo. Picturean ko.
The kid had already figured out how Kelly approached things.
May white
No matter what
studio
happened,
ka.
Kelly was going to play back with
Oh,
what he
mayroon.
said. And not only that, it was going to work out to their
Hindi
advantage.
kasi ako marunong eh.
He was an eternal optimist, a man who couldn't admit even the possibility that
I-message mo nga ako sa Sikoy. Hindi ako alam yan, Diyos ko. Hindi ko
Kelly could
kamao.
think whatever he wanted to. The only thing that
Si
mattered
Diyos,
was that they stay
49,
alive long
50,
enough to get
51,
those
52,
prisoners away from the
53.
Apaches. Valdez and Mateo came back to the fire. Valdez tossed the sack onto the ground.
12 more scalps,
Oh,
amigos.
Iano kita, picturean ko tapos basta isang sponsor, 4 na video bakasan mo. Nasa iyo yan kung damihan mo pagbakas, screenshot mo lang. Pasa mo sa akin para marami kang entry. Habol ka.
Valdez grinned, Chess smiled, and even Mateo nodded his head in agreement.
Malay mo, mabunot ka Sharon sa monetize agad. Mayroon, yun yung pinaka grand prize ko eh, yung monetize.
Magkaroon ka.
4,000 WH. Tsaka 500 bananas. Eh kung wala ka pang bananas, eh 500 na lang kulang mo.
Ano daw? Daming binababa. Tagal naman.
Wala na akong ibababa. Ano pa bang ibababa ko? Yung bulbul ko.
They rode away early in the morning.
Nag-aantay na lang ako na
Bodies for the buffalo.
mga 6 minutes na lang.
Though they had survived one attack,
Sa'yo na lang, ibababa ko bakikay sa'yo.
Bananas is ano?
Or 2 dozen or 3 dozen. And none of the men wanted to take any chances. Nobody had slept much after
Bananas is ano,
just fitful cat naps.
subscriber.
Man was always awake and on guard.
Ay, ito pala, dito tayo babawi kay ito malaki-laki ito, sponsor sa akin. Di atay, nakakahiya eh.
Not even a breath of air stirred
Banana
inside
is
the arroyo
saging.
where the men rode. The kid was glad when they finally reached the end of it. There wasn't much of a breeze blowing on the desert, just a faint stirring in the atmosphere.
Ano ba yung last ko?
But even that
53,
stuff to bring a little
54.
cooling to
Habang
sweat
wala
soaked
pang
skin.
oras, sige.
Not far away, foothills loomed, with the mountains behind them.
55.
The green pines dotting the slopes gave them a cool look, even though the air was as hot as ever. Up in the hills, the shade of those
Habang
pines
wala pa
was
oras.
really cool.
How will we know if we're ahead of the Apaches?
56.
Bawal po maglagay ng subscriber dito sa chat box.
Oh, bawal hindi ay, bawal.
Meron ka.
There are no
Mayroon?
fresh
Ika,
tracks.
i-listen ko, saglit lang.
Maybe they went some other way. We've been down
Saan
here
ba?
off and on for more than 2 years.
Si Ate kasi.
I know where they go. There are other trails through the hills. That's the one that leads to the pass. On the other side of the pass is the valley where San Bruno is located.
Bawal yan eh, bawal
Any other
magpalo
route
tayo
would
dyan.
take them days out of their way.
Pag ano na chat box,
What
bawal.
Kelly said made some sense, the kid supposed. The men drew their rifles as they rode
Ay,
toward the
tama
saddle
ba yung
between the two hills.
ginagawa ko?
They didn't want to ride up onto the rear guard of the
56,
Apache war party and not be prepared. Mateo inspected the ground closely. When they reached the
Uy,
top of the
nabuang man.
slope, they reined in.
Lagpas
Mateo
naman.
looked at Kelly and shook his head.
They haven't come through here yet.
The kid agreed with that conclusion. He hadn't seen any fresh
Nanubra,
tracks either.
magiatay.
He turned in the saddle and looked back to the northeast. They were high enough that he could see the vast sweep of that godforsaken
That-
wilderness.
5 to 8.
Somewhere out there, if they were still alive, were Jess Ritter, Violet
Pagkadaghana naman
Nelson
itong
and Leah
gibugi.
Gabbard. They were probably terrified
Sana ba ito dapit?
and humiliated by the degradation they had been forced to endure already.
Ay, Diyos
But the
mio,
kid
Marimar.
clung to the hope that they were alive.
Basura ni magdali. Ay,
As long as they were, there was a
mano mo
chance
po
to
nang
help.
itakuban man ini.
He had been
Kung
determined
guloy.
to turn his back on everyone's
Makita.
problems, including his own, but fate hadn't worked out that way. Kelly pointed to the slopes on either side of the gap.
Dan 5
Let's
to
get
8
up here and find some
bumimban.
good spots. Morgan and I will take this side. Mateo, you take Lupe and Chess up yonder on the other side. Lots more scouts.
Dami nyo entry ah. Grabe.
The kid and Enrique Kelly climbed about 50 yards up the slope, leading their horses. They reached an area that was thickly covered with trees, as well as having a cluster of boulders.
This is it.
Yan na, lumayas na si Bakikay. Wala na tao. Ako na lang.
Bias na sila.
They led their mounts behind the boulders and picketed them,
Sila,
then returned to the thick stand
sila
of
yatan.
pine. The spot gave them a good field of fire over the entire trail for several hundred yards.
Dami.
The kid looked at the opposite hill. He
Dito
didn't
pa
see any
kami.
sign of Chess, Valdez, and
Andiyan pa
Mateo,
pala siya.
even though he knew they were over there.
Dito pa ako eh.
Obviously, they were well.
Inires ko yung subscriber si Sikoy kasi bawal daw yan eh.
Men we've killed, there's still a lot more of them than there are of us.
Ang ano natin, grand prize, ano, 4,000 WH at saka 500 bananas.
Sa inyo
We
na
can put
ako
another
yan.
15 or 20 of them on the ground before they know.
Malapit na ako kahit 2 minutes na lang.
They won't know how many men are up here. So they'll try to get
Sain mo
out
na kumayang. Ay, kala ko si Kikay. Si Aaron pala.
Doesn't work out that way, we won't stand much of a chance.
Nobody ever said this life would be easy. Man's got to fight, and he's got to take some chances if he's going to get what he wants. Otherwise,
Tarirarira. Okay, sige, wait ko.
the only thing that's ever scared me is thinking about getting old and
Lapit na
dying
eh.
dead. I'm not
Asa raglistahan na pa. I-send ko kay Sharon na kina.
Exactly. Don't worry
Saan
about
mo
the kid.
lalagay?
Just
Ayan, may nakalista na ako dyan.
Now that they
Ayan,
were
ayan,
in
akin
position,
na.
all they could do was wait.
Ito,
The
oh.
kid had not been raised to be the most
Ay, yung
patient man,
isa.
but that life was in the past. Now he was able to stand still, alert,
Ay,
his eyes searching the desert to the
Ito na nga
northeast
lang.
of the foothills.
hindi makita yan dyan
And
eh.
after a while, sure enough, he saw something.
Sino yun? Si
It was just a smudge at
Jaswell.
first.
Jaswell 54 to
But
55.
as it came closer, the vague dark mass took on shape. It resolved itself into a large group of riders. As Kelly had said, the Apaches
Na
had
ano
been
yung
determined.
ano,
They
last
approached the
dyan si
foothills
Sikoy,
with the
nagkaduling-duling ako dyan.
military on horseback,
Biyaam na yan.
riding along tirelessly beside the horses. With their teeth.
54. Akala ko, hindi pa na Diyos ko, umabot na 200 plus pagbaba. Bayaan na, hindi ko na inulit. Hayaan mo na yan.
He wanted to be
Bakit?
sure the
Ay,
four women
ano
had
ba to?
went,
May,
but there was too great a chance
Hindi man
sunlight would reflect
ayun,
off the glass
ganyan,
and warn the
ganyan.
Apaches that someone was up there waiting for him. The kid
Para
knew he didn't
makita
run
niya,
that
no?
risk. He would just have to wait until they were closer before he looked for Jesse and the other captives. Now that the Apaches were almost there, the waiting was harder.
Kikay,
The
Dan,
kid felt his
45.
heart
1,
slumping in
2,
his
3,
chest
4,
as
si
the
Diyos
first
Dan.
riders in the war party reached the slope and started
Ano
up
ko muna kay
Hope's side.
Sharon para
His eyes
mapuntahan niya
narrowed with
mamaya.
intensity as he swept his gaze along the column. Like a splash of light in the middle of surrounding darkness, the sun shone on blonde hair. The kid leaned forward. The riders came closer and shifted around, and suddenly
Manong
got
ni
a
mo
good
may
look at Jess
internet ng
Kruger.
gigdabak.
Jess rode one of the Apache ponies by herself.
Josh TV,
Her
si
blouse was
Kikay.
in tatters, and her skirt was pulled up since she rode astride. The kid could tell by the way she held her hands in front of her that her wrists were tied together,
Yun.
but her head was up. And he was confident.
Bukas
He was
dahil
so
Sharon,
sure
ganitong
that
oras
he
uli.
He would
Malapit
see the
na ang
flies
anong
burning
pula
for
natin,
hours.
kaya
A few yards behind him,
magpa-entry ka na magpa-entry kaysa manood lang sa Facebook, wala yan.
that was probably Violet Price and her daughter.
Lord,
Farther back in the column, the fourth
Yan o,
captain,
puntahan mo
Leah
yan,
Bradley,
lahat.
rode in front of one of the warriors with his arm around her.
Hala,
Her long auburn hair
mayroon
hung
pa
over
pala
her
kay
face and
ano,
her head
kay
drooped
si
forward.
Sally at saka kay Ma'am
Everything about her
Geraldine.
screamed despair. The
Gibugi.
kid didn't figure he could blame her for feeling that way. As far as any of the women,
Kalimutan
no
mo na
help was coming for them, and no one was even aware of their plight.
si
It was
Madam Sally
understandable that they
Trevino.
would give up, but from the looks of things, Leah was the only one who had so far. Once she
Sino ba yung
realized that things weren't completely hopeless,
55,
almost maybe,
56.
but not completely, she might come around.
Abulin niyo muna to, guys.
For a second,
57.
the kid wasn't sure what Kelly meant, but then he realized he'd been concentrating so hard on the women that he hadn't noticed something very important about the Apaches. There weren't nearly as many of them as he'd expected. It was fairly easy to make a rough count. The
58.
kid came up with 42. That was
Bakay
still
ako nito sa
overwhelming
mga
odds
ano.
against 5 men, but he'd been expecting to see 75 or 80 Apaches in the group. Either the war party
59.
hadn't been as big to start with, as the reports Lieutenant Nicholson had gotten indicated, or else the Apaches had lost quite a few men in the raids they had carried out before hitting the wagon train.
If we can wake up half of them, then cut and run for sure.
Yan.
Then we can pick up some more while they're running. I'd have liked to get those other scouts, but this is all right. Wait until some of them.
Saka si Ma'am Geraldine, yun pala. Dalawa yung nakalimutan ko.
What about Jess Valdez and Mateo? They won't go to the fire too.
Impatience gnawed at the kid's nerves. Jess rode
Buti nga,
back,
na-picture
her head
ko.
turning
Kung
from
hindi
side
pa
to
ako
side, she
na-picture,
studied
wala.
the surroundings. The kid wondered if she was looking for escape routes. The prisoners were all in the front half of the column. Kelly let them go by. Then he looked over at the kid and nodded as he lifted his rifle. The kid rested his cheek against the stock of his Winchester and peered over the barrel. An instant after Kelly's rifle fired, the kid pulled his trigger. It wasn't a battle, at least not starting out. It was more like murder. The 5 men hidden on the slopes fired as fast as they could, pouring leaden death down into the gap between the 2 hills. The kid glanced across the way and caught a glimpse of Mateo darting from tree to tree, killing another Apache every time he paused behind another bit of cover. The kid realized what the Yaqui was doing. His actions made it seem like there were more gunmen up on the hill than there really were. The kid contributed to that illusion himself by dashing over to another tree and cranking off 3 swift rounds from there that dropped 2 more Apaches. At least a dozen of the Indians were down already, and more continued to fall, deadly accurate shots at the scalp.
Yan.
As Kelly had predicted,
Bumbin pa,
warriors
9 to
leading the column
12.
kicked their horses into a gallop. The kid saw that one of the Apaches had hold of the reins attached to Jess's and was leading. He swung his rifle and aimed at his back. The bullet drove him forward over his mount's neck. The reins fell free. Jess's horse was running loose now. The kid stopped shooting to watch as Jess leaned far forward and tried to retrieve the reins with her bound hand. Before she could manage to do that, the horse's flashing forelegs tangled with the dangling reins. And suddenly the animal fell, sending Jess flying off its back and sailing through the air as the horse crashed to the ground. The kid's heart leaped from alarm as he saw Jess land in a heap and roll over and over until she stopped and lay in a limp sprawl. He didn't know how badly she was hurt, but she wasn't going to have a chance to get away now, unless he was down there and died. He was about to turn away and run for his horse when he saw one of the mounted Apaches
50
racing
pa,
toward
40,
Jess's fallen
54,
horse.
55. Dan,
The warrior
unsay
looked up and
panihapon
pretended to pick
diha.
her up.
Wa pa, maluto. Di ah. Isugbahay pa, ginoo ko. Naluto na na, pero isugba pa.
Old rifle fire.
Doon kami at pikas balay.
Look the other way for a moment.
Habulin niyo muna yan guys. Dalawang binaba ko guys. Kahiya naman eh.
Anger and disappointment shot through him. He looked past the gas.
Jonathan, ano na lang yan. 8 piraso na lang yan kay Sally at saka kay Ma'am Geraldine Dewey.
A flash of auburn told him that Leah Gabbard was still a prisoner too. He couldn't tell about the price limit.
Son of a bitch. Don't worry, kid. We got more than half.
54, 55.
I
Ayan.
told you we know where they're going. We'll try to catch up with them before they get to San Remo. And if we don't, we know we can find a woman there. You'll sweet on one of those gals, kid. That's why you're so interested in them.
I just want to help them if I can. But the scouts are more important.
That was an outright lie, but Kelly seemed to believe it. He jerked his head in a nod.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of them down there now, just waiting for who they scout at night.
After the shooting had been over for a few minutes, Mateo and Valdez cautiously made their way down the slope to check on the bodies and start the grim work of harvesting the scalps. Kelly, Chess, and the kid moved out into the open to stand guard while the other 2 men were busy. When they finally
Habulin niyo muna guys.
leading their horses, Valdez held up 2 bulging, blood-stained canvas sacks.
24 more scouts! We're gonna be rich men!
Damn right. I counted 42 of the savages. That means there are only 18 of them left. And some of them are probably wounded. That's mighty good work.
Andyan pa ba kayo?
You gotta find the San Remo place where Guzman's headquarters are, Cal?
Sure, we've been there.
Well, if all the scalping's finished, let's get moving. There's still work to do.
Don't start giving orders, kid. But I've got to admit, I like your enthusiasm for the job.
Mateo had grown up in those rugged Mexican mountains and hills, so he led the way as the 5 men headed for San Remo. Not surprisingly, the Yaqui knew some shortcuts, but the Apaches would know those same shortcuts, Kelly warned. So it was possible they would reach the
56,
village first.
57, 58, 59, done po.
Said the Mexican government pays a bounty for Apache scouts.
Hey, that's right.
Yan, habulin niyo yan guys. Nahuli, nahuli.
And yet Guzman trades with the Apaches rather than killing.
Guzman works for himself, first and foremost. And his men work for him. Technically, they draw wages from the government. But the paymaster from Mexico City doesn't get up this way very often. The politicians established the rurales so they could claim they were protecting the people. Except for a few officers who take things a hell of a lot more seriously than they should. It's all a sham. The government doesn't care what the rurales do. Guzman trades with the Apaches because it makes money for him. Also, as long as he's doing business with them, the savages will be less likely to attack him and his men when they're out on patrol. Boy, which I mean, out hunting for slaves.
The kid could only shake his head in amazement after that long speech by Kelly. In his former life as a businessman, he had seen firsthand how corrupt the American politicians in Washington could be. But
Grabe,
evidently,
daghan na
the border version put them to shame. when it came to
56,
untaxed
57, 58, 59.
After everything he had experienced over the past
Si
few
Diyos.
years, he was no longer shocked by how low human beings could sink. But occasionally, the depths of their depravity made him wonder just how bad they could get. Right now, practical matters were all that concerned him.
If the Apaches are already at the rurales barracks when we get there, they've made a deal with Guzman. How do we persuade him to double-cross him?
The same way men like Guzman are always persuaded. Money. We'll offer to split the bounty with the rest of the scouts we take.
What's to stop him from killing the Apaches, taking their scalps, and collecting all the bounty?
Like I told you, there's a truce of sorts between Guzman and the savages. You can't just kill them openly. That's where we come.
So he'll make it look like you killed them, and he didn't have anything to do with it.
Hey,
Huh?
now you're catching on. Everybody gets something.
Wait lang. It's almost done here. Wait lang.
Well, now, you may be out of luck there. You never
It's
did
just
say
only
that.
6:40. Wait a minute.
But if you are, Guzman's
Sabi niya,
already
natapos na ba yung dinner?
for them. And if he hasn't, well, we may have to throw them in.
Sunod, ano kaya?
Sorry, kid. One way or another, those ladies will get it.
He shrugged
Huh?
and said that
Hindi nga, ayaw nga. Sa ubin nga, hindi nga
inside,
masarap
he
eh.
seethed with rage. Kelly might believe that just
Sabag sa oven?
Huwag niyo ito pakialaman ha, iwanan ko lang ito ganito.
Sige, punta.
But the kid wasn't going to let that happen.
Magbabay na ako guys, eh, nagalit na itong isa.
They climbed to the path through the mountain range. Mateo dismounted to examine the ground in the pass. When he looked up, he gave Kelly a curt nod.
You're ahead of us. How long?
1 hour.
That's long enough.
Zero
I'll get the time
PM na lang
ahead of
yan.
time.
I-PM nyo na lang ako ha, i-PM nyo na lang ako.
That was what I think.
Oo, titignan ko lang mamaya itong live mamaya. Titignan ko, tapos ilista ko kayo. Bulin ko. Babay mo na ha, bukas uli. Nagalit na tong isa. Pinakialaman.
It was still miles away, and the square adobe
Ayan,
building
59, 56, 59 at saka kay ano oh. Picturean ko na lang, G. Mamaya mo na lang lista.
Mateo leveled his arm.
Tara na, alis na tayo.
Kelly leaned forward in the saddle and squinted into the distance.
Yep, there they are, all right.
The kid took out
Ito
his
pa, kay
telescope and
Jonathan.
extended it. He aimed it in the direction Mateo
Post ko na lang sa FB mamaya.
After a few moments of searching, he found
Basta,
the light
anuhin ko to
riding
mamaya.
through the valley toward San Remo.
Iwanan ko muna kayo ha. Babay-babay na. Hanggang nagalit na si Amo.
Earlier had been easier targets for the scout hunters, and their scouts were stuffed in the Valdez.
Bait. Iwanan.
Jess and Leah each rode double with one of the warriors.